Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A new scientific study could radically change our view of the Sun. It seems that the Sun is not behaving as it should. Scientists have recently created what they call an MRI of the Sun's interior plasma motions. For decades, solar physicists have believed that at the Sun's core is a superheated thermonuclear reaction. This theory requires a massive transport of thermal energy to the Sun's surface through convection. But the results of this study indicate a virtual absence of convection, just 1% of what a thermonuclear core would require. How does this affect our understanding of the Sun?
The thermonuclear model requires several things to be going on, which don't appear to be going on. One is there's supposed to be a radiative zone inside the Sun, and then above that, a convective zone. And of course, the radiative zone is purely speculative. It's only required by the model. There's no evidence for it. And the convective zone is also speculative, based on the granulation that's seen on the surface of the Sun. That was interpreted as being the tops of convection cells. But the fact that they've discovered very little convection means that both the theory of the granulation, the theory of the generation of magnetic field, and the theory of transfer of energy from the centre of the Sun, all of these are in peril. And I would say that what we're seeing is the demise of the standard model of the Sun.
The absence of the expected convection is just the latest in a long string of surprises for solar physicists.
There are many anomalies. In fact, the very magnetic fields above the Sun and the very hot corona, none of these have been properly explained. There's been a lot of arm waving about energy is somehow transferred from inside the Sun to the outside without affecting the photosphere, because this is what's required. But this is a really weird kind of model where you've got 16 million degrees on one side of the photosphere and tens of millions of degrees up in the corona. And sitting in the middle is a 5,000 to 6,000 degree photosphere. And it's required very sort of extreme speculation as to how you would ever get that energy out of the Sun. And there's been no satisfactory answer.
Thornhill points to a different model of the Sun, which relies on the principles of plasma physics.
Well, the electric sun is energy received from outside the Sun in the form of an electric current lighting up the ionosphere of a body, which is no different to any of the other bodies in the solar system, only it may be much larger. And so we're looking at the top of the very top of the atmosphere, like the ionosphere of a body like, say, Jupiter or Saturn. Because of the electrical energy coming in, it's lighting up like any of the new gas discharge electric lights that you see in car headlights and so on. So that's what we're looking at, it's just an electric light. I think the theorists have to begin to look at plasma physics, real plasma physics, the physics of electrical discharges in low pressure gases, and forget about thermonuclear models at this stage, but concentrate on plasma discharge phenomena.
For continuous updates on space news from the Electric Universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Solar physicists are wrestling with a new mystery. Why is the Sun so perfectly round? Centrifugal forces in a rotating ball of gas should make the Sun wider at its equator than along its axis. But scientists working with the Solar Dynamics Observatory have obtained what they call the most accurate measurement of the Sun's shape. What they have found is that the Sun is far too perfectly round, forcing solar physicists to rethink their assumptions about the Sun.
They found that the Sun is actually much closer to a perfectly round circle than they had expected, based on their theory. Now, their theory has certain assumptions and certain models that they use to determine whether or not the rotation of the Sun is going to make it swash down and get a little bit wider through the equator, much like the Earth does. But as it turns out, despite the rotation of the sun, which is a complex thing in itself, faster at the equator than at the poles, the sun is not flattening out nearly as much as their theory expected. So when there's something that goes wrong with the basics of your theory, that usually requires a little introspection and anything ranging from tweaking to trying to redo the whole thing from scratch.
This discovery joins a long string of surprises for solar physicists. Is it possible that our fundamental theories about the sun, ideas that have guided astronomers for decades, need to be reconsidered?
Most of the observations of the sun have not fit theory. This is a textbook case of falsification, and you make deductions from your theory and come up with circumstances that you should find. You go out and look for those circumstances, and when you don't find them, your theory is falsified. It seems to me we need to examine Eddington's assumption back in the 1920s that the sun is internally powered. He adopted that assumption because he couldn't think of any mechanism for an external power. Now we know that the universe is composed of plasma, and from laboratory experiments we know plasma is electrically active. So that revitalizes revisiting the assumption, is the sun powered externally?
A sun powered by external electrical input could answer many puzzles of solar behavior, from the missing solar convection to temperature anomalies, to acceleration of the solar wind, and many more. Since gravity is insufficient to overcome centrifugal forces on the sun, the ability of electromagnetic forces to confine plasma must now be explored to explain the sun's roundness.
The sun and almost everything we see in the universe is ionized, and it's in a state that's called plasma, the fourth state of matter, but is not discussed very widely. Because it's in an ionized state, which means that electrons are stripped off the atoms, and it becomes a lot more susceptible to electromagnetic forces. Usually astronomers think primarily of gravity and collision type forces as the root causes of everything that goes on, but electromagnetic forces are actually much stronger, or can be much stronger under the right circumstances, than the force of gravity. But to incorporate the forces of electromagnetism and electric currents and very chaotic magnetic fields which change over time into their model is a very difficult thing to do. In fact, the numerical simulations of plasmas are almost intractable, which means unsolvable, because they get so complex and so chaotic so quickly. As the size goes up, the scale of it goes up and everything.
There's reputations and salaries at stake on this, so there's a strong incentive to patch the theory rather than examine assumptions. There's also the cost of if you adopted a new theory, you would have to rewrite the books and change curriculums and reprogram computers. So there's a good reason for not adopting a new theory. However, that's expediency. It's not science. And lately we've been, it seems like expediency has taken over science. We're in the dark age of science.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On August 6, 2012, the NASA rover Curiosity touched down on the planet Mars to begin the latest investigation into the Martian environment. It seems that NASA's scientists are most curious about whether Mars could have ever supported microbial life. Beyond this, much discussion in the science media has centered on internet hoaxes and misunderstandings that have duped many in the general public. Based on the NASA press releases, one is left to wonder, do any real mysteries remain for Curiosity to explore?
Well, it is true that there's a great deal of rumor mongering on the internet, and this gives NASA officials an opportunity to correct misinformation and to be more informed on the subject than those who are spreading the rumors. But there is an irony in all of this. Here on the surface of Mars today, we have a rover named Curiosity. And this rover is a witness to stupendous technological achievement. But the irony is that within the theoretical sciences today, curiosity is absent. Here we have a laboratory in space, the planet Mars, which offers such a unique opportunity for discovery in the sciences. But the questions are not being asked. Just consider, for example, the mystery of the Martian profile as a whole, where you have such a split personality, completely unexplained. Two hemispheres so radically different. In the north, virtually no craters. In the south, dense cratering. How could that be? We make assumptions about planetary evolution and hold on to those assumptions for decades after they've stopped working.
Mysteries surrounding Martian geology may run far deeper than the general public have been led to believe.
The key piece of evidence is the shape of the planet. The northern hemisphere is actually lower than the southern hemisphere. And it's not just that that planet was somehow squeezed into an odd shape. The definitive consideration is the crustal depth. For reasons that no planetary scientist has explained, the crust of the northern hemisphere has been excavated. It's been eaten away, up to 6 miles deep. And there is one force only that could achieve hemispheric excavation of a planet. That force is electric discharge in an age of planetary instability and violence.
A reconsideration of Martian geology could challenge many of the underlying assumptions of planetary science.
Planetary scientists have long maintained that you can date the surfaces of rocky planets and moons by counting craters. This would make the southern hemisphere of Mars 1 billion years older than the northern hemisphere. But if Mars was engulfed in electric discharge in the past, one of the first questions to ask is whether that pervasive cratering in the southern hemisphere could be explained by electric arcs. And electrical experiments by plasma scientist C.J. Ransom of VimaSat Laboratories showed that production of craters by electric arcs can also generate the telltale markers that you see on the planet Mars, including the central darkened bumps of so many craters and the general darkening of the heavily cratered terrain. These are not patterns that would be expected from random bombardment by rocky bodies from space over 1 billion years.
The cratering patterns created by high-energy plasma discharge to a solid surface may help explain the many anomalous crater forms on Mars.
It really is a fact that textbook theory does not account for Martian cratering patterns. Bizarre hexagonal craters, for example. A hexagon is a common trademark of electric discharge. So-called bullseye craters, where one crater centers on another beyond all probability. Craters with towering central peaks that terminate in another crater. Finely terraced crater floors and crater walls. Huge mesas sitting squarely within a surrounding crater. Sharply scalloped walls, as seen in the case of the famous Victoria crater. Also, the endless strings of craters or crater chains. And what about craters with central spherical domes? Incredibly enigmatic. Is it a coincidence that Dr. Ransom got exactly the same form in electric discharge to a Martian-type soil? The cratering mysteries on Mars are just the beginning. And if NASA will open the door to an electrical interpretation, a different picture of solar system history is certain to follow.
For continuous updates, welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. According to a new report, scientists are now on the verge of deciphering the mystery of dark matter. Researchers working with data from the Planck satellite have detected an intense form of radiation called synchrotron radiation from the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Scientists at the Niels Bohr Institute have interpreted these radiation emissions as evidence of dark matter. Professor Pavel Miselski says of the discovery, We know from theoretical predictions that the concentration of dark matter particles around the center of galaxies is very high, and we have a strong argument they can collide there, and in the collision, electrons and positrons are formed. These electrons and positrons start to rotate around the magnetic field at the center of the galaxy, and in doing so, produce this very unusual synchrotron radiation. But is this really a plausible explanation for synchrotron radiation in space?
Astrophysicists have found from observation that various results that they come up with demand that there be more matter in galaxies, for example, than they actually observe. And so they postulate dark matter to allow their results to all be explained by gravitation alone. In a sense, you could say that before it was observed, Uranus was dark matter because its position was postulated purely by gravitational theory, and then they found it. So before it was found, it was in a sense dark matter, but they're taking this to ridiculous extremes now. But it's the same sort of argument that they're using. Here we've got some results. We need more actual matter to explain them, so it must be there. It's just that we can't see it.
You can't see dark matter. Dark matter is invisible, and it's invented to save theory. So wherever they see something that doesn't fit the theory, they can always put some dark matter there, and then they'll make the theory fit what they see. So dark matter is kind of a blank check that they can write for it. Whenever the theory fails, they can write a check for dark matter, and then they'll say, oh, this proves that there's a circularity to it, that we proved the existence of dark matter because we assumed it was where it needed to be.
Emissions of synchrotron radiation have long posed an unsolved mystery for mainstream astrophysicists. The mystery resides in the spectacular acceleration of charged particles, beyond anything astronomers had anticipated in space.
Synchrotron radiation is basically radiation that's given off by charged particles that are spiraling in a magnetic field. And technically, it refers to X-rays from particles that are moving near the speed of light. But if you have particles that are moving much less than the speed of light, they still give off radiation. It's just at a lower energy level, so it's radio instead of X-ray. The problem that astrophysicists have is that they have this taboo against electricity in space. And so in order to get the charged particles to spiral in the magnetic fields, they have to do it with some mechanical means, which is usually collisions. So metaphorically, they bang rocks together to get electricity. If it were up to them, I guess they would light street lights by falling rocks. Astrophysicists mostly just ignore the synchrotron radiation. Once in a while, they'll admit it, like this time when, there's synchrotron radiation at the core of the Milky Way. Wonder how many rocks we have to bang together to get that.
The discovery of synchrotron radiation fulfilled the prediction of plasma physicist Hannes Alfvén as early as 1950. Alfvén claimed that electric currents moving inward along the arms of the Milky Way would generate stupendous electric discharge, and synchrotron radiation would be its defining signature.
Alfvén's first insight back in, I guess, in the 20s was that plasma responds to magnetic fields. And he had this idea that if you have a perfect conductor, the magnetic field will become frozen into it. And so astronomers assume that any plasma in space will be a perfect conductor and the magnetic field is frozen in, and any charge separation will be immediately canceled when the charges come back together. So you can't have sustained electric fields in space. Well, Alfvén repudiated that. His further experiments showed that plasma isn't a perfect conductor and that it has a small resistance and that it does sustain electric fields. The experiments since then and in space have shown that plasma is extensively electrically active. Especially if you have two clouds of plasma moving relative to each other, they will induce electric fields and electric currents in each other. So,
which is a game changer. That alone, knowing that alone, you have to reify. You have to go back and just start over with your theories, because they ruled all of that out by decree 100 years ago, and their dogmatic theories have been supporting that stupid decree the whole time. So I mean, it's time. That's all it is. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's pseudoscience and blah blah blah. Well, a lot of people are dumb. You know, a lot of people don't realize that plasma physics is actually a classical physics, and it's been studied for hundreds of years, and that we understand a lot of its attributes. Not everything, of course, but a lot of the attributes. And some of the attributes are actually, I mean, some of the anomalous effects from the sun and other heavenly bodies that we cannot fit into standard cosmological theory, gravitational theory, is actually a prediction and an expected trait of plasma physics. So it's almost like, you know, it's walking like a duck, it's talking like a duck, it's quacking like a duck, it's floating like a duck, it's got little fins like a duck on the feet, you know, it's got wings like a duck, it's got a mallard ring around its neck like a duck. I mean, it even has sex with other ducks. This is how much evidence we have, and you still don't want to call it a duck. And it makes babies with other ducks. I mean, this is how ridiculous it is. So that we don't apply this plasma cosmology or physics to the cosmological sciences. So here we are, breaking standard cosmology.
So then you get all the effects of electrified plasma, the Birkeland currents and filamentation, magnetic fields, double layers, and especially acceleration of charged particles and synchrotron radiation.
The electromagnetic effects in the universe have got to be brought to the forefront in the researches of all astrophysicists. They've got to be alongside gravitation, if you like. They've got to realize that, yes, gravitation accounts for a lot and tells us a lot, but what about these electromagnetic forces? These ideas have been around. We've got the work of Birkeland, followed up by Alfvén, and then again in more modern times by Anthony Peratt, where they've got all this theory, they've got all these experiments to back it up. Not mathematical theory just, they've got experiments to back it up. This stuff has to come through. I'm not saying gravitation doesn't have a role to play, but they're not going to explain things if they don't bring in the electromagnetic force.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Outside of the Earth, the Sun is the most heavily observed and studied body in the solar system. Yet almost all of the Sun's features present major quandaries for solar physicists, from acceleration of charged particles away from the Sun, to heating of the upper atmosphere or corona, to the Sun's polar jets, to a virtual absence of solar convection, to superrotation of the equatorial atmosphere, and many more. More and more people are wondering if the conventional model of the Sun needs to be reconsidered. A carefully constructed experiment is now being proposed to answer the long-standing mysteries of the Sun. The goal of the experiment, called the Sapphire Project, is to create an electrically driven miniature Sun in the laboratory.
My first question with respect to the EU is this a testable hypothesis? And it appears to me that it's very testable. You can't test the current hypotheses, a number of reasons. Number one, they say that the Sun is, billions of years old. Well, when you have a model like that, it's an untestable model. There's a number of disparities with the current gravitational model that can't be tested. The electric model, on the other hand, it's a very simple model. What we want to do is see if we can recreate the natural, as naturally as possible, what we consider to be the environment that the Sun lives in. Number one, that means a rarefied gas. whether it's nitrogen or neon or whatever it may be. We want to put a sphere in the center. We want to have an anode and basically do a discharge between the two in that rarefied gas. We also want to be able to reverse the polarity or the potential, the voltage potential between the two, and see if it's possible to recreate a number of the phenomena. And that would include, arc discharging. I think one of the more significant features would be what we call superrotation of the sun, which means, I think it was SDO observed that there's this torus of charged plasma rotating around the sun faster than what the sun is rotating. Now that's significant, because you would expect that the sun itself would rotate faster than basically this cloud of plasma, but the opposite is true.
Many anomalous features of the sun may be explained if the sun is at the center of a heliospheric electric field.
To have confidence that the sun itself falls within the hypotheses that it's electrical in nature, there's quite a bit of evidence, as a matter of fact. Recent discoveries, things like coronal mass ejections, as an example, happening concurrently on either side of the sun, which is an occurrence that you would expect to see in an electrical model. Back in Berkeley's day, he wrote about this, seeing arc discharging on either side of the sun. And he had conferred with other friends and colleagues that were solar astronomers at the time, and they were saying that the things that we're seeing going on inside the chamber here are very close to what we see going on with the sun. Other things like spicules and sunspots, which occurred in some of these experiments even in the 60s and 70s, have been observed, but not measured, not seen or checked to see if, in fact, these things are similar or identical to what we see going on with the sun, as well as ion acceleration. I do a lot of physics, and for something to accelerate means that there's an energy behind it accelerating this. Right?
Or in other words, they basically have been demonstrating that the sun is electric for decades now.
You would expect anybody to either maintain its velocity,
Did you hear about that in school yet?
but to decrease its velocity, but not increase its velocity the further away it gets from the body that it's being discharged from. But that's occurring on the sun. Things like temperature differentials. Why is the surface of the sun 3,500 degrees Celsius, which is cooler in some respects than what an arc welder is? And the photosphere itself is hotter yet and would approach being in the same order of magnitude as an arc welder. And then we get into the corona, which is even hotter again in millions of degrees.
Given all of the recent surprises for solar physicists, and given the enormous significance of the sun in human life, is it time for mainstream scientists to begin testing theories that propose a radically different view of the sun?
As far as the universe is concerned, and more specifically the sun, I think that there's a lot of interest in what's going on with it because of its effect on climate technologies. When we talk about coronal mass ejections, we all know nowadays that it can have a significant effect on our way of life, most especially with electronics and power grid. So I think that coming to an understanding of the sun that would better quantify the model is very important.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. For many years, astronomers have expressed confidence in their understanding of the origins of the universe. Today, most astronomers agree that a primordial creation event called the Big Bang gave birth to the universe precisely 13.7 billion years ago. But a new scientific study is one of many findings that raise significant questions about this theory. Researchers using the Hubble telescope have spotted an astounding spiral galaxy. Astounding, they say, because it shouldn't exist. The researchers have dated the galaxy's age at 10.7 billion years old. Lead author of the study, David Law, says of these findings, the fact that this galaxy exists is astounding. Current wisdom holds that such grand design spiral galaxies simply didn't exist at such an early time in the history of the universe. What are we to make of these and other findings that defy the underpinnings of the Big Bang theory?
Standard theories dictate the faster an object recedes from Earth, the farther away it is, because the primordial Big Bang explosion is supposed to have imparted an initial push that's causing the universe to expand. Using those theoretical parameters, a faster recessional velocity means greater distance, which means an earlier time period in the universe. And since an object almost 11 billion light years away is from the so-called early days of the universe, it shouldn't exhibit such complexity of form because there wasn't enough time since the Big Bang for that complexity to evolve.
Astronomers are surprised to find a high redshift galaxy with spiral structure. It has a redshift of 2.18, and most galaxies with that high of a redshift have irregular shapes. This one has well-defined arms, and it even has a companion at the end of one of them. The Big Bang theory assumes that redshift is an indicator of distance, which would put this galaxy at about 11 billion light years away. If it's that far away, it's therefore large and bright. But modern astronomy dismissed the observations of many astronomers in the last half of the 20th century, astronomers like Halton Arp and the Burbages. They found that high redshift objects tend to cluster around nearby low redshift objects. They found many physical connections, and they even found some high redshift objects in front of low redshift objects. These observations were misrepresented, and the misrepresentations were disproved. So with that excuse, the observations were dismissed and the Big Bang theory was saved. This is kind of a new scientific method. Instead of observation, theory, and testing, the data is judged by its conformity with belief. If it doesn't conform, then there's something wrong with the data, and the data is dismissed. In this case, fervency of belief replaces testing. If redshift is not proportional to distance, then the universe is not expanding, and there's no Big Bang.
Scientists in the electric universe community suspect that high redshift is intrinsic to the plasma environment of a young or newborn galaxy.
This galaxy is likely nearby, small, and faint. In the electric universe hypothesis, high redshift is an indicator of youth and being highly charged. High redshift objects are born by electrical injection from older galaxies. So the companion at the end of the arm indicates that this galaxy has had recent ejection activity. It's an active galaxy, and active galaxies are usually spiral. So in the electric universe hypothesis, this object isn't surprising at all. It's expected.
The same electric force responsible for a galaxy's redshift may also give rise to its spiraling structure and other features such as polar jets.
One of the most significant contributors, I would say, to plasma cosmology and the electric universe theory was Dr. Anthony Peratt, a plasma physicist. And he was a protege of Hans Alfvén, the famous Nobel laureate. And Peratt studied plasma formations in the laboratory for many years. And what he did was create what are called particle and cell animations on supercomputers. Galaxies are, rather than being condensations of gas and dust that are gravitationally bound together, were actually plasma formations. And he thought that these simulations showed that cosmic plasma is confined due to self-consistent magnetic fields. And these magnetic fields are induced by currents that are flowing through the plasma, creating filamentary structures. And a cross-section through these filamentary structures indicated the formation of several galaxy configurations. And among those configurations were elliptical and barred spiral shapes. So Peratt insisted that plasma, along with electricity, engenders the structures in the universe. And since galaxies are often strung like pearls through space, or like beads on a string, that galactic arrangement lends credence to that idea.
For continuous updates, welcome to Space.
Most people don't even know that. They think, oh, all the stars are like islands in space, separated from one another. But when you look at them through infrared, you can see these magnetic connection lines that connect them all. They're like literally on a Christmas light, string of Christmas lights. They're connected. And it's visibly obvious. And there's really no denying it anymore. And then you, especially when you see that with your own eyes, like you guys just did with that, as the galaxies, all those galaxies all strung together like that with those, the infrared, that's the magnetic, that's a spectrum of the magnetic field lighting up for you. It's showing you. And the reason that's important is because there's no magnetic fields without that induction or that electrical hybrid. It's a hybrid electric of magnetics and dielectrics to make electricity. So one doesn't come without the other, you know.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Science headlines around the world tell us almost daily about astronomers' observations of black holes in deep space. These headlines imply that the existence of black holes is no longer in doubt, but not every story suggests that all is well with black hole theory. Recently, astronomers using the VLA telescope made a surprising discovery. They observed two bright radio spots in the globular cluster M22, which they interpret one black hole at most should be present in the cluster. The National Radio Astronomy Observatory reports of these findings. Simulations have indicated in which all of them, or perhaps all but a single one, would be thrown completely out of the cluster. But as is often the case in media discussions of black holes, are we really seeing the complete story?
It's felt that really all but one of these black holes are expected to be ejected from the cluster through various kinds of dynamical interaction, even though, as they point out, perhaps hundreds of these may be formed originally when the globular cluster is condensed. They also note a relative lack of black hole binaries in different kinds of globular clusters that have been observed. But let's just back up a little bit and be clear about what's really being observed here. The way the paper is reported, and even the way the original journal article is written, the things being observed are labeled unequivocally black holes. But what is really being observed is a couple of bright radio spots in the sky. In this case, it was two relatively bright radio spots. That's it. What is inferred from that is that each of those radio spots is a binary with a black hole and another star, with the other star feeding the black hole hot gas, which is accelerated and superheated to the extent that it emits, in this case, radio, but more often than not, we're talking about X-rays, that they'll see a bright X-ray spot with an X-ray observatory, and what's inferred is that's a black hole that's emitting X-rays, but we don't see a black hole. We don't see an accretion disk, which is apparently emitting the various kinds of radiation. We don't even see a binary. What we see is an energy source, a dot, basically, against a darker background of the same energy. So in this case, the authors see these two radio sources in M22 and propose that there are two black holes of what's called stellar mass, about 10 to 20 times that of our sun. After that initial proposal in the paper, it's then taken as fact that we're looking at black holes.
Hilarious.
Also missing from media coverage is an historical perspective on the evolution of black hole theory in response to surprising discoveries in space.
What's interesting is the way that this accretion disk model has evolved. On one hand, there was mathematical abstraction of a black hole, which attracted mathematical physicists because of the elegant way in which the field equations, in which Einstein's field equations could be solved. And there was an increasing complexity of the boundary conditions that were allowed around the field equations to create different hypothetical versions of black holes. And you can read this in the history of black holes and how those boundary conditions were enhanced. And then at the same time, observations of highly energetic events that we're being increasingly seen because the kinds of devices, the kinds of observatories and the number of observatories and the frequencies that we were allowed to see at, and radio and UV and X-rays and gamma rays, it's difficult to assign an engine to drive them. And in a cosmological framework that really uses only gravity to explain how things work, being able to take the mathematical abstraction that had been sort of evolving in parallel, that was the tool in the toolbox that came to hand. It was very clever, the construct that was created around these binaries that cannot be seen, the accretion disks that cannot be observed. But what I find worrying is the way that it's adopted now is the only explanation. It worries me that any time an X-ray source is observed, it's a black hole. So that the media and the general public are left with the feeling that we are directly observing black holes all the time. It's not the case. We're observing very high energy, very distant high energy events, like X-ray flickers in our observatories. They're not black holes. There are unexpected and variable radiation sources, sudden flashes of gamma rays or sudden flashes of X-rays that coincide with optical emissions at the same time. And it usually results in very convoluted explanations involving a binary, accretion disk, gases that are being dammed up somehow and then allowed to flow and accelerate to create these flashes of energy. Whereas these kinds of intense and periodic or variable energetic events can be observed with plasma behavior quite commonly in the lab or at different scales.
For decades, scientists working with electrified plasmas in the laboratory have succeeded in reproducing both high-energy emissions and extraordinary structure that we now observe in space across the entire electromagnetic spectrum.
For a long time, the idea of electrical currents in space was sort of poo-pooed, but now we know it's quite common. The space between the Earth and the Sun is known to have huge plasma filaments of electrical current, creating large ropes of magnetic fields. So if we're forced to accept electrical currents in our solar system, is it not possible to accept large-scale electric currents, and even more so, accept large-scale high-energy electrical events? Gravity is very, very weak. To achieve these energy densities with a gravity-driven engine, you need supermassive and super dense objects to make it all work. You can create very high-energy plasma events in the lab. Exploding double layers, arcing, etc., output gamma rays, X-rays, and so on. These are high-energy electrical events you can create in the lab and scale. You cannot create a black hole and an accretion disk in the lab, but you can sure create these electrical plasma phenomena, and they scale up very nicely to these kinds of galactic and stellar sizes. So my feeling is, why go so exotic in sci-fi with black holes and event horizons and so forth? Occam's razor dictates we accept a simpler, falsifiable explanation.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned.
I was never watching, so I got, I know a lot of stuff about this. If you got a question or you think you know something that's, contrary. Oh, great. Contrary to this.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.welcome to Space
News. Jeez. A little technical difficulty there. Yeah, what kind of issue do you have? No, they're not at CGI. Yeah, you're just making that up. Sorry, dude. These come from radio telescopes and stuff. You might be one of them flat Earth guys, huh? Probably. Whatever.
as proposed by physicists.
Yeah, NASA lied, but this is what they lied about. They told you there was no electricity in space.
In his 2008 article, Electric Gravity in an Electric Universe, Thornhill asks, when we apply force to a body, how is that force transferred to overcome inertia? The answer is electrically, by the repulsion between the outer electrons and the atoms closest to the points of contact. The equivalence of inertial and gravitational mass strongly suggests that the force of gravity is a manifestation of the electric force. Today, Bishop Nicholas Sykes further elaborates the query he first posed in his previous episode. What is the speed of gravity? And he elaborates the explanations for gravity that the electric universe proposes.
My last Space News video about the light-exceeding speed of gravity, titled "What is the Speed of Gravity?" provoked some reactions. Someone wondered if I had never heard that gravity was not a force, but a bending of the fabric of space-time. Another argued that gravity did not need explanation because it was something that was just there. Einstein's proposition that nothing can travel faster than light has become so entrenched that even some of us, identifying with the EU model as a whole, find it difficult to give fair consideration to the claim that gravity operating as a real force requiring a real explanation necessitates a real transmission far greater than the speed of light. Yet even if we are only at the beginning of providing such an explanation, it is important for the integrity of the EU model to adhere always to a simple force-based model for gravity, because gravity does, when all is said and done, manifest itself to our senses as a force. The electric universe model is constructed with explanations that invariably exclude just their formulations, which are, in effect, widely used agreements to discard the need for rational explanation. As a result of such agreements, the scientific landscape is littered with such follies as black holes, dark matter, dark energy, multiverses, and magnetic reconnection, all of them being just their formulations without rational explanation, designed to plug the holes in popular science theory with the unexplainable. Sir Isaac Newton understood that he was unable to formulate an explanation for gravitational attractions, even while he described the behavior mathematically of bodies under gravitational influence over vast distances with astounding accuracy. He speculated on gravity's cause, but decided to leave that issue to a future generation who might bring better tools than his to master the task. Our own generation does indeed have better tools than his, but we have become distracted from the task he and others bequeathed to us by a multitude of follies. These consist of the extraordinary plethora of the just there formulations that prevent us from accomplishing what Newton and others bequeathed to a future age. If one reads the book Relativity by Albert Einstein, published, for example, in 2004 by the Folio Society, one will see that he develops the concept of light or electromagnetic radiation being the fastest possible messenger merely by assuming that since nothing was observed to go faster than light, then there is no credibility to the idea that anything could go any faster than light. In chapters 7, 8, and 9, for instance, he assumes that information from two simultaneous flashes of lightning could never, by principle, reach an observer any faster than light speed in a vacuum. From that simple idea, the whole theory of relativity was developed, starting with the deduction that two simultaneous events in one frame of reference might not be simultaneous in a different frame of reference. The theory of relativity, as conceived by Einstein, depended therefore entirely on the idea that one could never make deductions about space and time that might ultimately rest upon anything going faster than the speed of light. It is therefore illogical to assert, without any other reason for doing so than the theory of relativity itself, that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. To make such an assertion would be to engage in a tautology, i.e. circular reasoning, because the theory of relativity is founded upon that assertion in the first place. Only if the theory were independently and incontrovertibly verified by observation or experiments might this be reasonable, and such is often assumed to be the case, as Einstein himself hoped that it would be. But so far as I am aware, there is not a single case of this theory's verification that may not reasonably be disputed. Under these circumstances, therefore, it is entirely scientific to consider the possibility that there may well be something observable or reasonably deduced traveling at a speed faster than light. As has already been indicated in my videos, the motion of the planets in the solar system requires that the force of gravity between the sun and its planets, assuming as we must that this is a real force and not a mental construction of some kind, must be transmitted between them at a speed many orders of magnitude faster than the speed of light. And the physicist Wal Thornhill shows also that such speeds of force transmission are just as necessary within what we call the fundamental particles of matter for the stability of those subatomic structures as it is for the stability of stellar planetary systems. Indeed, by such concepts, the physical foundation of the mathematical structures of quantum mechanics may yet be revealed and made clear in a way similar, perhaps, to the clarification of the physical foundation to Sir Isaac Newton's mathematical principles of gravitational action, that great task that he and others bequeathed to generations yet to come. In such manner, the electric universe model holds out a great promise, the promise of a physics and a cosmology that rest upon a secure foundation to replace what is taught in our prestigious schools, the current model, which, as Einstein himself discerned, relies upon two foundations, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, that are themselves mutually irreconcilable.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill explored the many obstacles that institutional science and academia face in attempting to understand climate change on Earth. As Thornhill explained, no climate models can succeed that rely on outdated and unproven assumptions, such as the belief that the Earth and Venus are twins, and Venus's super hot temperatures are created by a runaway greenhouse effect. In this episode, Thornhill emphasizes the necessity that climate scientists finally recognize the electrical circuitry connecting the Earth and Sun, which may in fact drive climate and weather.
In climate science, we must truly understand the electrical space environment as well. Nobel Prize-winning plasma cosmologist Hans Alfvén published the Sun's electric circuit in 1986, but he assumed the Sun was a generator in a closed local circuit rather than an electric motor connected to the galaxy. The faster rotation of the Sun's equatorial plasma is evidence for the motor. The solar discharge has a very effective feedback system to maintain steady radiant output while the electrical power input varies. In fact, the solar radiant energy is termed a solar constant, which of course is critical to the anthropogenic global warming argument. But the Sun is a variable star when viewed in X-rays, which are diagnostic of the electrical input to the Sun. However, no account is taken of this variable electrical power focused on the Sun and intercepted by the planets. The constancy of the Sun's brightness is simply explained by the electric universe model of bright stars, where the photospheric anode tufts, or granulations, have a natural transistor action in limiting the current and therefore the energy dissipated in the photosphere. An electrical connection has been traced from the Sun to the Earth's magnetosphere, from the magnetosphere to the ionosphere, and from the ionosphere into weather systems. No one can claim to be a climate expert while ignorant of the electrical nature of the solar system. This cosmic energy source explains the reports of simultaneous warming on the other planets. It is the main driver of climatic variability. Human carbon emissions count for nothing in comparison. It seems there is an unconscious human aspect to the climate change debate. Why do we keep repeating the mistakes of the past? Why can't we get a grip and witness our self-delusion and hubris in believing that in the last instant of our existence, we have uncovered the secrets of the universe? Why do we so strenuously ignore the evidence for recent global catastrophe and, by doing so, not recognize the origin of our innate fear of doomsday? Is it that apocalyptic fear that drives the need to feel in control of nature? But as Bill Gates says, Mother Nature doesn't care what humans believe in. Ignorance and fear are our undoing, and both are at the heart of the global warming debate. To help us feel safe in this unpredictable universe, we favour fictional stories over the truth. We can't tolerate uncertainty. No matter how far-fetched the idea, if the climate is changing, we must take the blame so that a remedy seems possible. But that exposes us to exploitation by authorities. It's a familiar pattern of behaviour. The early astronomer priests attained great power by presenting the facade of human control in being able to predict frightening eclipses. More recently, our astronomer priests received considerable funding and recognition by playing on our doomsday fear of comet and asteroid impact. This game has been so successful that the same people are doing it again by pointing at Dante's Inferno on Venus and suggesting a similar fate for the Earth. But for the adventurous few who accept the uncertainty of our existence, the fossil record and the ravaged faces of other planets and moons bear witness to a dynamic history of the solar system. It's abundantly clear that the story of Venus is quite different to that of the Earth. The scare campaigns only work because of our frightful ignorance. A search for the truth must first establish a sound foundation, and that requires a broad historical perspective that few physicists ever achieve. Those who do take the trouble generally ask awkward questions and are ostracized as deniers, skeptics, or cranks. Scientific truth cannot be arrived at democratically. Either something is true or it is not. The claim that most scientists believe in anthropogenic global warming is worthless. The majority of scientists once believed the Earth is the centre of the universe. Kessler is right. History shows that major progress is achieved by individuals, call them seers, and not by bureaucratic institutions. But seers are the people who today are shut out by peer review. Generally, seers have no peers.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A new paper published by an MIT physicist claims to theoretically prove that so-called quantum entanglement, or two particles each seemingly occupying multiple states simultaneously, gives rise to a wormhole, which allows particles to communicate through a so-called gravitational tunnel. This theory follows from a paper published earlier this year, which suggests that when two black holes become entangled, then are pulled apart, a wormhole is created which connects the black holes. The reasoning in these papers follows from a purely mathematical approach to physics and cosmology. In this two-part presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill examines just how reliable this approach is at describing how the universe actually works.
A glaring example of the irrational is to be seen in a recent Science Daily report titled, "You Can't Get Entangled Without a Wormhole," which refers to papers by Julian Sonner, a senior postdoc in MIT's Lab for Nuclear Science and Center for Theoretical Physics, and a related paper by Kristen Jensen of the University of Victoria and Andreas Karsch of the University of Washington. The article says that essentially entanglement involves two particles, each occupying multiple states at once, a condition referred to as superposition. For example, both particles may simultaneously spin clockwise and counterclockwise, but neither has a definite state until one is measured, causing the other particle to instantly assume a corresponding state. The resulting correlations between the particles are preserved even if they reside on opposite ends of the universe. End of quote. Now, the word entanglement is a euphemism to hide the fact that the physical connection is unknown. So all that follows isn't physics, it's mystification. The indeterminacy of states also means we are not dealing with physics, which relies on being able to determine the state of the system being observed. From a real physicist's point of view, the most telling experimental fact is that the connection between two entangled particles is instantaneous, even if they reside on opposite ends of the universe. So the article asks the question, but what enables particles to communicate instantaneously and seemingly faster than the speed of light over such distances? The simple classical physics answer is that the connection between the two particles is not via a slow transverse electromagnetic wave. Instead, it's the same kind of connection that we observe between the planets and the sun. That is, gravity. Newton's law of gravity does not include time. The force of gravity acts instantaneously. Now, the electric universe explains that gravity itself is a form of the electric force that operates upon neutral bodies by distorting the subatomic charged particles within those bodies. To form tiny, weak electric dipoles. This simple model explains why gravity is such a weak force, because subatomic particles are infinitesimally small, and also why you can't easily shield from gravity, because all of the subatomic particles participate, whether it's a conductor or a non-conductor, whatever it's made from. Importantly, though, gravity on the cosmic scale allows us to see that the direct electric force between particles operates instantly. The spookiness and non-locality of quantum phenomena can be understood both physically and in meaningful language. Entanglement, then, is simply an electrical resonance between two subatomic particles, each comprised of an identical resonance system of orbiting charged subparticles. In other words, it's a repeated pattern, like an atom within an atom. The instantaneous connection maintains the resonance or entanglement between the particles regardless of their relative movement or distance apart. Because the connection is instantaneous, there is no Doppler shift detuning or anything like that. The two particles remain in communication. This model that separates the phenomenon of electromagnetic waves in a medium from the direct longitudinal connection between all matter in the universe, that is the electrical connection, opens up new insights for physicists. For example, physicists attempt to isolate their experiment from outside influences, including the observer. But in our electric universe, there is no isolated system. The observer is a part of the experiment, whether he likes it or not, and as discovered in so-called weird quantum experiments. Contrast this simple explanation with the meaningless language of the report. and I quote, "Earlier this year, physicists proposed an answer in the form of wormholes or gravitational tunnels. The group showed that by creating two entangled black holes, then pulling them apart, they formed a wormhole, essentially a shortcut through the universe, connecting the distant black holes. Now, black holes are a mathematical mistake equivalent to the school mathematics howler of dividing by zero to get infinity. Gravity is weaker than the electric force by a factor of 1,000 billion times. Now, that's as close to zero as you can get. So using gravity to explain the concentrated energy sources observed at the centers of galaxies and calling them black holes is bound to give you answers that make no physical sense. The wormholes are a geometric construct in more than 3 dimensions, so they have nothing to do with the real space that physicists, engineers, and you and I have to deal with." But the article continues. Now an MIT physicist has found that, looking through the lens of string theory, the creation of two entangled quarks, the building blocks of matter, simultaneously give rise to a wormhole connecting the pair. That's the end of the quote. But string theory is, according to Peter Woit, not even wrong. The questions that need to be answered by this piece of whimsy are both endless and pointless. Pointless because no one knows what a quark is, nor how matter can warp space to form a hole across the universe, or even what that means, nor how that effect can be instantaneous. Space is merely a concept of location in 3 dimensions. How do you warp a concept? But the article goes on. The theoretical results bolster the relatively new and exciting idea that the laws of gravity holding together the universe may not be fundamental, but arise from something else. Quantum You'll notice that modern physics is in the business of complicating things beyond comprehension, inventing new particles and forces in the hope of a Nobel Prize. It is not the way classical physics was done. Classical physics, until the beginning of the 20th century, was in the business of simplifying particles and forces. There was a strong intuitive feel on the part of leading scientists then that gravity is simply an electrical force of some description, like the forces between atoms that form our Earth and everything on it. That's the conclusion of the electric universe based on all the new evidence since then. The article says, of course, there appears to be a major barrier to reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity. For years, physicists have tried to come up with a theory of quantum gravity to marry the two fields. You'll notice that the standard picture of a black hole or a gravitational object in space is represented as a funnel in space-time, usually with an object like, in Earth's case, the moon, perched on the edge of the funnel, with the idea being that the moon, instead of traversing a straight line in space, follows the curve of the funnel. However, the very image itself gives a false picture, because we just assume that this gravitational well or funnel has gravity pulling from underneath to draw the object down into the funnel. But this is using gravity to explain gravity. It's a circular argument, and the image is quite misleading. An object perched on the surface of this funnel, if gravity were not pulling it down, would remain fixed on that funnel. It would have no force downwards, sideways, or upwards. It would remain exactly where it is. It's plain to see that general relativity never explained gravity. It merely described its effect in a geometry that has no reality. And quantum mechanics is a recipe book with no understanding of the ingredients or how they interact. As a result, the rest of the article is appalling nonsense headlined, "Tunneling to the Fifth Dimension." It's only necessary to highlight the meaningless language to show the ideas expressed are imaginary. For example, two entangled black holes forgets that the mathematics of black hole theory allows only a single black hole in an empty universe. The Newtonian principle of superposition of gravitating objects doesn't apply to general relativity. There can never be a second black hole to get entangled. The theorists invoke a wormhole, a tunnel through space-time, produced by pulling two black holes apart. Hyphenating the words space and time to produce a fourth dimension is physically meaningless. Mathematicians use the word dimension to mean a degree of freedom in their equations. There are only 3 physical dimensions in space which are measured by length and direction. Time has no length or direction. You can't point in the direction of time. Time has no arrow. Joining space and time has no physical significance. So you cannot produce physical wormholes in space. It is pure science fiction. One of the authors, Sonner, applied this thinking to quarks, the theoretical subatomic building blocks of matter. And I quote, "To see what emerges from 2 entangled quarks, he first generated quarks using the Schwinger effect, a concept in quantum theory that enables one to create particles out of nothing." End of quote. Here we see mathematicians resorting to dismissal of the principle of physics that you cannot perform a creation miracle. It's not scientific. The author Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy parodied this sleight of hand mercilessly when Zaphod Beeblebrock used an infinite improbability drive to rescue Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent in deep space. Particle physicists have been using the infinite improbability principle since the inception of quantum theory. As is well known, Einstein hated the idea. He's reported to have said, "God doesn't throw dice." He was right. As soon as you disconnect cause from effect, you are not doing science. Another quote from the article, Sonner mapped the entangled quarks onto a 4-dimensional space, considered a representation of space-time. In contrast, gravity is thought to exist in the next dimension as, according to Einstein's laws, it acts to bend and shape space-time, thereby existing in the 5th dimension. End of quote. There is no 4-dimensional space. There is no physical 5th dimension. Gravity is not explained by general relativity. It is merely described in a limited and unreal geometric way. It is not shown how imaginary 4-dimensional space can be walked. Cause and effect are disconnected. It just ain't science. It's merely mathematics. The article finally leaves all common sense and logic far behind. And I quote, "To see what geometry may emerge in the 5th dimension from entangled quarks in the 4th, Sonner employed holographic duality, a concept in string theory. While a hologram is a 2-dimensional object, it contains all the information necessary to represent a 3-dimensional view. Essentially, holographic duality is a way to derive a more complex dimension from the next lowest dimension." End of quote. This is total rubbish. There is no 2-dimensional object. All objects are 3-dimensional, so there can be no information held in 2 dimensions.
Dumb as shit.
Real objects and information can only occupy 3 dimensions. Coming back to the Space News report, the black hole is an alleged product of Einstein's theory of gravitation, but so is the wormhole between the 2 supposed black holes. It's known as an Einstein-Rosen bridge. But then the wormhole is used and related to the 2 black holes to define gravitation. Gravity emerges from the more fundamental phenomenon of entangled black holes, the article says. But this argument is simply a circular argument, and so it is nonsense.
For continuous updates on Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 2 of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill continues his discussion of the growing confusion in theoretical physics. While sensational news headlines sometimes laud definitive science breakthroughs, such as the supposed discovery of the so-called God particle, in reality, more and more scientists are warning that physics and cosmology have reached a state of crisis. The depth of this crisis was summarized in a recent speech by Dr. Neil Turok, the director of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. Dr. Turok states, "Theoretical physics is at a crossroads right now. In a sense, we've entered a very deep crisis. If you ask most theorists working on particle physics, they're in a state of confusion. The extensions of the standard model, like grand unified theories, were supposed to simplify it, but in fact, they made it more complicated. It's the ultimate catastrophe that theoretical physics has led to this crazy situation where the physicists are utterly confused and seem not to have any predictions at all. This confusion may be evident
Nada.
in popular science media, in which the general public receives speculations ranging from the bizarre to the nonsensical.
Now, if I haven't convinced you that mathematical theorists aren't scientists but players of mind games, then perhaps a news report of December the 13th will tip the balance. It's headlined, "Could the universe collapse today? Physicists claim that risk is more likely than ever and may have already started." And I quote, "The universe could be about to collapse and everything in it, including us, will be compressed into a small, hard ball. The process may already have started somewhere in our cosmos and is eating away at the rest of the universe," according to theoretical physicists. The mind-bending concept has been around for a while, but now researchers in Denmark claim they have proven it is possible with mathematical equations. End of quote. You can't prove anything with mathematical equations. They merely describe observations in a way that might provide new information and insights. But if the mathematics is based on false or unrealistic concepts, or applied inappropriately, the interpretation will not reflect reality. This news article in the Mail Online is a glaring example, and I quote again. "The basis of the theory is that sooner or later a radical shift in the forces of the universe will cause every particle in it to become extremely heavy. Everything, every grain of sand, every planet and every galaxy will become billions of times heavier than it is now." End of quote. Now, this prediction is from theorists who do not understand why matter has mass. Amazingly, they have a standard model of massless particles. There's no such particle. Instead, theorists conjure up a cosmic treacle of Higgs particles to produce the effect of mass and other subatomic particles. I quote again. "The theory suggests that the new weight will squeeze all material into a small, super hot and heavy ball, and the universe as we know it will cease to exist. This violent process is called a phase transition and is similar to what happens when, for example, water turns to steam or a magnet heats up and loses its power." End of quote. Now, theorists are fond of invoking super dense matter and super heavy objects simply because their equations need it to make their crazy gravitational models work. No one has ever observed super dense matter. I quote again. "According to something known as the Higgs theory, a phase transition such as this took place 1/10 of a billionth of a second after the Big Bang, causing a shift in the fabric of space-time." End of quote.
Whoa.
The Higgs theory merely demonstrates that theorists have no real idea what they're talking about. According to this theory, particles gain mass by interacting with the so-called Higgs field that permeates all space. But this field is another barnacle on theoretical physics that will need scraping off in future. As for the Big Bang, the evidence has been available for decades that the universe is not expanding. There was no Big Bang. Of course, an expanding universe gave great joy to the mathematicians because it allowed them to reconstruct a fanciful, pseudo-religious story of the creation of the universe from a non-physical point. But miraculous creation is not allowed in physics. And I've already discussed the unreality of space-time, which here is given totally undeserved solidity by describing it as a fabric. Reading articles like this, the mind is numbed by words that have no meaning, but give a verisimilitude of scientific meaning. Now, Professor Herbert Dingle was an English physicist and natural philosopher who served as president of the Royal Astronomical Society from 1951 to 1953. For a time, he wrote the entry on special relativity for the Encyclopaedia Britannica. That was until he realized that it made the mistake of interpreting perception as reality. He became the center of a famous controversy concerning special relativity. So in 1970, he published a book titled Science at the Crossroads. In it, he wrote of his peers, and I quote, "As a general rule, the practice of mathematical physics goes hand in hand with lack of elementary reasoning power and of that normal form of human wisdom, somewhat misleadingly called common sense, that provides its own corrective of premature judgment and never allows the requirements of reason and experience to be overcome by the seductions of attractive speculations." So despite the warnings in Herbert Dingle's book, Science at the Crossroads, modern science barreled through the crossroads against the red light and all the road closed warning signs so that today it is headed for the inevitable crash.
For continuous updates on space news from the Welcome to Space News. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On December 28, 2013, the acclaimed astronomer Halton Arp passed away at the age of 86 in his home in Munich, Germany. Art posed a challenge to the very foundations of modern cosmology, a challenge that only grows more relevant with new, astonishing discoveries. We present Wal Thornhill as we honor Arp's remarkable contributions to science and astronomy.
I was first introduced to Halton Arp's work by Mel and Amy Aitchison after one of our very first meetings in Portland, Oregon. They could see the relevance of Arp's discoveries to the electric universe that I was then presenting. That was in the mid-90s. In September 2000, I had my first meeting with Halton Arp in Portland, once again at one of the Electric Universe meetings. And it was quite a historic meeting because of the other people who were there, in particular Tony Peratt, who is known for his groundbreaking work in plasma cosmology. And the input from both of these people to the Electric Universe has been considerable. It was only a month later in October that I actually shared the stage in London with Halton Arp.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe.
Oh God, sorry guys.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A team of astronomers is claiming to have observed an object whose existence shatters the underpinnings of the Big Bang theory. The quasar group, called Huge LQG, is supposedly so enormous it would comprise roughly 5% of the observable universe. By conventional reasoning, an object of this size simply cannot have formed since the theoretical Big Bang explosion. According to lead author Dr. Roger Close, the finding upsets the foundation of everything we do. But as is so often the case with baffling space discoveries, are we being told the complete story?
The question that arises from this is the finding of a gigantic quasar cluster, which, according to the headline, shatters long-held theories of space, is that it actually shatters the long-held theory of the Big Bang. But that's not specified. It's just put in general terms because, of course, there is no alternative to the Big Bang theory at present, or at least there isn't according to conventional science. Of course, the Electric Universe sees all of this as being confirmation of Halton Arp's work of decades ago, where he actually predicted that these highly redshifted objects, the quasars, would appear to be larger and larger and brighter the higher the redshift, simply because of this idea that the redshift is a measure of the distance. Now, Halton Arp has shown, and the Electric Universe actually expects, that quasars are merely faint because they're young. They've just been recently hatched, so to speak, from a parent galaxy, and they're highly redshifted. But they are born from nearby galaxies, so these things are much closer than the 9 billion light years that is specified in the article.
This large quasar group, they call it the Huge Quasar Group. It's almost 9 billion light years away. That's if the distance is proportional to redshift assumption that they make is true. It's 4 billion light years long. The press release says it would take 4 billion years to cross it, which makes it sound like it's more or less spherical. But actually, it's only 1 billion light years wide. It's actually a filament. The paper that reports on it says discreetly that it's substantially elongated. That's quite a bit elongated. It covers 20 degrees of the sky. You could put 40 full moons side by side along the length of it. Of course, it's thin. It's not anywhere near spherical. The sizes come from the assumption that the distance is proportional to its redshift. Its redshift is 1.27, and The magnitudes of the quasars in it range from 18 to 19. There could be some fainter ones because the survey arbitrarily cut off at 19. It lies 25 degrees west of the Virgo cluster, and the magnitude range of the objects in it are similar to the Z=1 quasars that Halton R is associated with the Virgo cluster. It overlies three Messier galaxies, M95, M96, and M105, which are a little bit closer than the Virgo cluster, according to the standard reckoning. So it's kind of on the fringes of the Virgo cluster. And my first guess is that these quasars are actually ejections from these Messier galaxies at the edge of Virgo. So if they're at the conventional distance of the Virgo cluster, then this huge group is only 20 million light years long instead of 4 billion. It's 200 times closer than what they think it is, and it's only 0.5% as big as they think it is. The result of the distance is proportional to redshift assumption is that astronomers are looking at gnats swarming around their heads and thinking that they see fleets of 747s on the horizon. The observational evidence that undermines the distance is proportional to redshift assumption has been known since the 1980s from the work of Halton R, who noticed that these high redshift quasars had a statistical and oftentimes a physical association with nearby active galaxies. Standard astronomers have ignored this evidence, and they've backed themselves into not just a corner, but a very long dead end. If redshift is not primarily a measure of distance, then the expanding universe and the Big Bang cosmology are obsolete.
The astronomers' observations of huge LQG also challenge the cosmological principle, which theorizes that the universe is homogeneous or the same in all directions.
The cosmological principle actually goes back to Newton. It's the assumption, again, there's that assumption, that we don't occupy a unique place in the universe, that at sufficiently large scales, the universe will look the same from every point within it. So if this holds up, this would mean that at the largest scale, the universe is not homogeneous, that this clump of matter couldn't have developed from gravity since the Big Bang.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The following presentation is an adaptation of the Picture of the Day article, Old and Far Away, by the Thunderbolts Picture of the Day managing editor, Stephen Smith. The link to the article can be found in the description box of this video. The Big Bang Theory states that for some reason, not explained, an eruption of energy from some other realm replaced nothingness with what was to become the present universe. The theory was proposed because Edwin Hubble, using the recently completed 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson Observatory, believed that he observed galaxies receding from the Milky Way. The most surprising part of his discovery was not recession itself, but the high velocities associated with his measurements. Some galaxies appear to fly away from his observatory at thousands of kilometers per second. Adapting the Doppler effect from Christian Doppler, who came up with the idea in 1842, to the spectra of various galaxies, Hubble thought that the change in location of particular elemental signatures called Fraunhofer lines, per the German physicist Joseph von Fraunhofer, indicated that light waves were shifted toward the red end of the spectrum by an apparent recessional velocity. Fraunhofer lines are supposed to occur at specific frequencies. If they are in a different position, then they have been Doppler shifted because of the element's velocity. Using this system of redshift, some galaxies are measured to be moving away from Earth at close to 90% of light speed. The original inertia imparted to the universe from the Big Bang is said to be responsible for the massive velocities that astronomers believe they detect. Since distance and recessional velocity are correlated with a timescale, a galaxy that is observed at 10 billion light years is thought to be as it was 10 billion years ago, because ancient light traveled through space for 10 billion years before finally impinging on their detectors. Although so-called dark energy expansion can change that value. A recent press release announced that astronomers found the farthest object ever seen, a galaxy with a redshift of Z equals 11. Using the following formula seen on your screen, an object with a Z of 3.5 means a recessional velocity of 90% the speed of light. However, since the universe is supposed to be expanding through time, other calculations, such as the one seen here, are used because that expansion factor is included. Whenever extremely high velocities are detected, astronomers believe that it is the cosmological expansion factor that is more relevant, and not just raw speed. The Z equals 11 measurement indicates that the galaxy, known as GN-Z11, is traveling through time and space at an astounding 98% the speed of light. A co-author of the same paper also stated, the discovery of GN-Z11 showed us that our knowledge about the early universe is still very restricted. How GN-Z11 was created remains somewhat of a mystery for now. Although many observations contradict the consensus view, and have been doing so for 40 years or more, those data are ignored or marginalized. High redshift objects, like quasars, are often found in axial alignment with galaxies that possess substantially lower redshift. Indeed, they are sometimes connected to those lower redshift galaxies by, quote, bridges of luminous material. If so, they must reside locally with each other at the same distance from Earth. Their redshift discrepancies must be from some other factor not related to their distances. There must be something intrinsic to their makeup that leads to the deviation. The late astronomer Halton Arp assembled a catalog of discrepant redshift associations, in which he describes anomalous structure or physical links among objects with radially different redshifts. Arp thought that the redshift measurement of quasars is composed not of a velocity value alone, but also depends on what he called intrinsic redshift. Intrinsic redshift is a property of matter, like mass or charge, and can change over time. According to his theory, when quasars are ejected from a parent galaxy, they possess a high intrinsic redshift, Z equals 2 or greater. As quasars move away from their origins within galactic nuclei, their redshift properties begin to decrease until they reach somewhere near Z equals 0.3. At that point, the quasar resembles a galaxy, albeit a small one. The inertial moment of ejection is eventually overcome, and the mass of the quasar increases while the speed of ejection decreases, until it may become a companion galaxy. It is in that way that galaxies form and age, evolving from highly redshifted quasars to small irregular galaxies, and then into larger barred spirals. Regardless of how the universe came into existence, or how its stars and galaxies form, the state of affairs in modern astronomy is rapidly deteriorating into theoretical fantasies that can no longer support the observations. For continuous updates on space news from Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In a recent Space News episode, we begin the first of a series of reports that challenge the very underpinnings of consensus scientific theory on the nature of stars, including our own sun. Ever finer technological data continues to provide increasing opportunities to test the respective predictions of the electric universe theories versus those of institutional science. As Wal Thornhill explains in the first of this two-part episode, new discoveries all point toward the perhaps inevitable confirmation of the electric star theory.
Scientists don't understand stars.
Not a single feature of the sun is predictable based on the standard model of the sun. We can't see inside the sun except for a peep through the holes punched in the photosphere we call sunspots. And there we don't see energy trying to escape from inside the sun. It's cooler down there. That's why the sunspots appear dark. But as usual, a model, once adopted as a standard, becomes a belief. Stars are believed to be isolated thermonuclear campfires in the sky that eventually burn out. All data must be fitted somehow to the model or discarded as an error. The operative word is somehow. No alternative model is possible. That is how we fallible mortals apply the scientific method. Many who are familiar with the electric universe have said to me they can't watch astronomy programs because the blatant misinformation makes them angry. The programs begin with a litany of facts, most of which are baseless. For example, a popular online lecture in physics enthuses, and I quote, "A star is born when nuclear fusion ignites and produces heat. The star is formed first when matter falls in gravitationally. Matter attracts each other and falls in and heats up to tens of millions of degrees. Then nuclear fusion produces energy and the star is born. Our sun was born about 5 billion years ago." End of quote. So goes the myth. There is not a single fact in any of this. It ignores the recent evidence of stars being born in molecular clouds along glowing current filaments. It doesn't match the story. The discovery shows dust and gas is efficiently scavenged over many light years towards the current filament, unlike weak gravitational collapse, which is limited in range and directed radially inwards towards a center of mass. Any rotation of the cloud inhibits gravitational collapse, giving time for the heat generated by matter spiraling inwards to be radiated away. Nuclear fusion in stellar cores composed somehow of the lightest element, hydrogen, is the improbable claimed result. The fusion model of stellar energy was grasped at more than a century ago, simply because it seemed like the only option for an isolated star producing prodigious energy for unimaginable time spans. Yet as our project manager and chief engineer of the SAPPHIRE experiment, which is designed to test an electrical model of stars, pointed out, the steady shining of countless stars in the night sky requires they be lit by a simple controlled process. The hydrogen bomb model applied to stars is not simple, stable, or testable. If it were the answer, our night sky should resemble a fireworks show. Meanwhile, our experimental attempts to force nature to conform to our beliefs have led nowhere in the quest for fusion power like the sun. Clearly, scientists don't understand stars, their birth, how they shine, and their supposed death. Recent reports highlight this obvious fact. Phys.org reported on September 12 last year, and I quote, "Stars form within the dense regions of diffuse molecular clouds, but the physical processes that determine the locations, rate, and efficiency of star formation are poorly understood. Recent thinking envisions an approximate two-step process. First, a network of dense filaments form due to large-scale turbulence, and then fragmentation into cores occurs as gravity starts to dominate. In the dense gas, the structure formation is affected by motions induced primarily by three processes: supersonic turbulence, self-gravity, and magnetic fields." End of quote. The words "poorly understood" are code for "we have no idea." There is no known way that supersonic turbulence and magical magnetic fields can produce the many light years long, constant width, glowing filaments and their structured magnetic fields. Astrophysicists are ignorant of Hans Alfvén's prediction made decades ago that stars would be formed precisely that way by powerful scavenging of matter along magnetically pinched galactic current filaments inside molecular clouds. The reason given by one astrophysicist: "We know there's electricity in space, but it doesn't do anything." Such is the dysfunction of narrow specialism in science. So a star is not formed when matter falls in gravitationally, and matter doesn't fall in and heat up to tens of millions of degrees. The electrical accretion process stratifies elements radially according to their ionization potential. It produces cool cores of heavy elements like beads on a string, but nuclear fusion in a cool, heavy element core is impossible. So it makes far more sense that stars are a cosmic electrical phenomenon involving their photospheres. Fusion occurs on the sun, not in it. All stars produce the heavy elements seen in their spectra by warm plasma fusion and neutron capture in their photospheres, in contrast to the brute force approach of particle physicists requiring incredible pressure and millions of degrees. Earlier in May last year, there appeared a groundbreaking paper in the journal Astronomy and Astrophysics, which showed a slingshot effect in a star-birthing filament of the Orion Nebula. These glowing filaments snake about inside the nebula like the radiant filaments in novelty plasma balls. The stars are formed while moving with the filament, but as the star gets more massive, it is slung out, ready formed and switched on as the glowing filament accelerates away. This may help explain the size limit of stars. Stars are the electromagnetic offspring of electric galaxies. So nearby stars have rotation axes that line up closely with each other because they are all spun up along the same rotating electrical umbilical cord, known as a Birkeland current. Do we have evidence for the alignment of spinning stars born in the same event? Yes, we do. And as usual, it has mystified researchers. On March 14th this year, John Ross in the Australian National Newspaper reported, Australian astronomers studying stars' internal upheavals have opened a new fault line in theories about the universe's formation. Researchers monitoring star quakes, the stellar equivalent of earthquakes, have found a startling symmetry in dozens of swollen stars known as red giants. The findings open a new mystery around the formation of clusters of stars from swirling clouds of molecules and gas. Co-author Dennis Stello said these gas clouds rotated on their own internal axes. Astronomers had assumed the initial spin orientation would become scrambled by the colossal turbulence generated when they coalesced into families of stars. The results were unexpected, said Dr. Stello. We found that the spins of most of the stars were aligned with each other. Previously, it had been assumed that massive turbulence would have scrambled the rotational energy of the clouds where the stars were born and prevented this alignment. This statement shows characteristic blindness toward earlier evidence that also doesn't fit the accepted story of star birth. So the published paper doesn't refer to the filamentary star birth paper, where the answer to the mystery clearly lies. Specialists tend to ignore other specialists, even in their own field, when findings are off the edges of their belief map. Such is the dysfunctional state of modern science.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Oh, Dave. TheDrugWar.com. I forgot about him. Probably in jail. Or probably just got off online for a while to give his health a break or something. Nice guy, but crazy. Crazy as fuck. Not wrong.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, Dr. Michael Claridge, a scientist on the Sapphire Project team, began his analysis of a recent landmark discovery, which shows a surprising relationship between sunspots and solar flares. As Dr. Claridge explained, the discovery that solar flares seem to have a powerful influence on sunspots is highly problematic for standard solar theory. In this episode, Dr. Claridge explores what may be the fundamental difference between the standard and electric universe concepts of the sun. And that is, in an electric universe, stars are not the isolated bodies envisioned in standard theory.
Welcome to Pioneers in Healthcare. I'm Dr. Len Saputo, board certified in internal medicine and have practiced for nearly 40 years here in the Diablo Valley. This show is about people who are special people who have made contributions to medicine that are unusual and outstanding. And today we have a special guest. His name is Dr. David Rasnick. He has a PhD in chemistry from Georgia Institute of Technology. He has 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical biotech industry. He has studied HIV/AIDS since 1980, and he's a former president of Rethinking AIDS and the former president of the International Coalition for Medical Justice. He's a member of the Presidential AIDS Advisory Panel of South Africa, and he's worked closely with Peter Duesberg from UC Berkeley on the aneuploidy theory of cancer, which we'll do on another day. He's also was a senior researcher with Dr. Matthias Rath at the Health Foundation in Africa. He has a book out that's called Germ of Lies, which you can find on lulu.com. David, it's wonderful to have you here. It's such a privilege to be working with you today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
We have kind of a long and interesting history because you're a researcher. You've been involved in the pit, okay, where the information comes out that tells the clinicians, the doctors, what's a fact and what's not a fact. And things have gotten all bungled up. And here we are now with a lot of different ideas about what HIV and AIDS mean. And maybe that's a good place to start. You know, people kind of make the assumption of HIV and AIDS, and there's a lot of controversy about whether or not that's true. What is HIV?
HIV is a retrovirus. It's one of at least 3,000 or 4,000 that have been cataloged. And it would be the first retrovirus to cause disease if it were true that it caused any disease at all.
So there's never been a retrovirus that's been known to cause a single disease in the history of medicine.
That's true. And HIV, I'm among many other scientists around the world, probably several thousand, that have concluded, based on the evidence, that HIV is completely harmless and it certainly does not cause AIDS or anything else.
So you're saying it's much like a PSA might be in prostate cancer, where the PSA goes up, but there's no point treating the PSA because the problem is it's a cancer someplace.
It's worse than that.
Okay.
It's totally worse than that. HIV has never been obtained from a human being. People should understand that. Retrovirus.
Never been cultured from a human being.
Never been obtained from a human being.
What does that mean?
For example, like if you have hepatitis or flu or cold or measles or chickenpox, any viral disease, you can take a sample of blood, or at least from the wound or the pox.
You can culture it.
Don't even have to culture it. There's a virus there that you can quantify without even culturing. You can culture, but typically you can spin it in a centrifuge and get a little bit of it in a vial, and you can quantify it. It will be infectious, viable virus that you got directly from the patient. If you put it into another human being, that will infect the other human being. That has never been done with HIV.
That's just really hard to believe. I mean, that's some of Koch's postulates. I mean, that's who's the guy who was the infectious disease, father of infectious diseases.
Yeah.
Who says you have to do that to prove that actually a disease is caused by a particular organism.
Well, HIV led the bandwagon where you can basically invent something out of thin air and turn it into a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of billion-dollar industry. Another example would be the hepatitis C, which is even acknowledged by Chiron, which used to exist, the company that made the original hepatitis C test, that they never ever actually obtained hepatitis C. They just got bits and pieces of it and then inferred what this virus must be. And people to this day are being tested for something that has never ever been obtained from a human being.
Now, is there an association between people who are HIV positive and tend to get AIDS?
Yes, it's an association by definition.
Okay.
In fact, you cannot get AIDS by definition unless you have antibodies to HIV.
So you can find the antibodies to HIV virus. Does that mean that the virus is there if you can make an antibody against it?
No, it does not. In fact, the presence of the antibody, that's the principle of immunization. It means that your immune system is won out and it's defeated the pathogen, the virus, and it's gone. That's, for example, if you've ever had measles or the chickenpox, you'll have antibodies to it, but the virus is not detectable.
So when somebody has something like mumps or measles or chickenpox, and they have antibodies, the illness is done.
Exactly.
They don't have the antibodies when they're sick. And that's exactly the situation you're saying about HIV and AIDS.
That's right. They generate it over time, and that's how they defeat the viral infection. But it's even worse than that. The inserts that come with the antibody test for HIV say explicitly in there that they have no reference standard to determine whether or not the antibodies that they detect positive in the test actually have anything to do with HIV. They don't even know if those antibodies are really from HIV because they have no reference standard.
Well, how did we ever get to a situation then? This is not making any sense. How could a logical physician or the whole medical profession come to the conclusions based on no evidence? Or is that probably a question you want to ask me? I don't know.
I mean, I've asked myself that too, because when I was a young scientist in my early 30s, back in 1980, when this whole AIDS thing popped up, I was eager to get on to it, work on it like every other scientist that I knew. It was such a bizarre thing. You know, it was all these weird diseases I'd never heard of in my life were occurring, popping up exclusively in gay men. I mean, that's strange. I thought it was my Andromeda strain, you know, at the time, and I wanted to work on it. But I learned years later that the Centers for Disease Control had actually accurately figured out what AIDS was as early as 1982. They had discovered that it was a drug disease, that the reason that these AIDS diseases, these immune deficiency diseases and other diseases were the direct result of chronic use of recreational drugs, amphetamines, poppers, heroin, cocaine, and things like that.
Okay.
How that changed was by decree at a press conference on April 23rd.
By decree?
By decree.
There's a scientific approach. I, the king, now say it's this way, so therefore it is?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
I remember it very distinctly because, remember, I was a scientist eager to know. I'd spent about 4 years wondering how I could apply my talents as a scientist to work on AIDS. But nobody really understood in the scientific world what was causing AIDS. And then on April 23rd, 1984, Margaret Heckler, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, brought out Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute and said that he had discovered the probable cause of AIDS. The very next day, they deleted the word probable.
And Robert became a fact.
It became a fact. Robert Gallo applied for a patent on his HIV test that very day. The federal government got behind it. Now the federal government, we taxpayers, as of this year, because of the latest legislation for the PEPFAR program, which had just voted in another $48 billion for African AIDS, we have now spent $250 billion, $250 billion on AIDS. American taxpayers have, just not the drug companies, not volunteer organizations, but the federal government has spent this money.
Wow.
And they have not saved the first AIDS patient. They use that fact to advertise more money to do AIDS research and to warn people about safe sex and condoms and things.
Okay, now people are talking, and one of the things I know you know a lot about is the infectiousness of this disease.
Right. Supposedly.
Well, that's what everybody says. You turn on the television set and you start hearing people talking about AIDS, and what they're talking about is be sure you have a condom, make sure that you're...
Sexual transmission.
Yeah, it's an STD.
Right.
And what does the data actually show? Is it?
Well, the first thing the data is clear on, absolutely, totally clear, is that retroviruses, remember HIV is a retrovirus, are not sexually transmitted, even if it caused AIDS. It is not sexually transmitted. Scientists have known this for, I guess, 50 years. You can fingerprint and mix a bunch of lab rats together, and this brand has a certain endogenous retroviruses.
Right.
This one does. You mix them together. They do not transmit them sexually to each other. You can take them out, and you can identify what strain of rat they are by their spectrum of retroviruses, because they don't get mixed.
My goodness.
And the same is true with human beings. No study has ever shown, even with HIV or SIV, the so-called simian immunodeficiency virus, no laboratory experiment has ever demonstrated sexual transmission of a retrovirus, including HIV or any of its laboratory equivalents.
Well, then where did the whole medical profession get the idea that this is an STD? I mean, you shouldn't have to answer that, but you probably know the answer.
Well, it took me a while because you see, again, we have a quarter century now of this stuff. And I started out being as mainstream as you can get.
Yeah.
I made organic chemist by training, and I've worked in arthritis, emphysema, parasites, cancer, and then AIDS. And so I thought, well, all I need is the target. now we have a virus, and I know viruses have enzymes, and I try to make inhibitors for these enzymes. And then over the course of my being a scientist and being confronted with the contradictions of the results of the research data, you have to scratch your head and you say, wait a minute, retroviruses are not sexually transmissible. Nobody's ever obtained a viable sample, free infectious HIV from a human being. What's going on here? And it was clearly by certainly 1985, all up to 87 for sure, that AIDS itself was not a contagious disease. It stayed within the same risk groups. It was 8 out of 9 AIDS cases to this day are still male, and 60% are gay men.
So in fact, how can that shouldn't be able to discriminate between one person and another?
There's no virus that knows whether you're white or black, gay or straight, rich or poor, or what zip code you live in, except HIV, apparently.
Would you have any idea why the CDC is saying that this is an STD and that we should be careful? It's a sexually transmitted disease.
This is area for speculation because there's no documentation, whatever. There's no study that shows that even AIDS itself is sexually transmitted. In fact, all of the studies that tried to quantify the efficiency of sexual transmission of HIV, by the way, have never succeeded in even coming up with an estimate that they could base it, that was based on scientific data. Zero. In fact, the largest controlled study, Nancy Padian, it was done, I think, in 1996, American Journal of Epidemiology, it was published in, showed it was a 10-year study. It was the largest of its kind. Not a single one of the there was these discordant couples. One was HIV positive, one was HIV negative, and many of them, probably most of them, I don't remember the exact numbers, did not use condoms or anything during the course of this study. Not a single HIV sexual partner, HIV negative sexual partner, became HIV positive during this. Nobody has ever demonstrated that an HIV negative person becomes HIV positive via sexual intercourse.
That's just shocking.
It is.
And yet the physicians, okay, I have to say that I feel very sorry for physicians. These are people trying to do the right thing. They're good people. They're clinicians, but they're not scientists. And they depend on the literature that's being published. And they also listen to the kinds of documents that come out of CDC and FDA about what's right and what's not right. How are we going to help those people to understand something in a different sort of way that gets the truth out there?
Well, money has killed the whole scientific process. I'm a scientist, and over my 30 some odd years of being a professional scientist, I watched it go from being one of the most democratic activities on this planet, far more democratic than any regular political.
Integrity.
Lots of integrity,
right stuff.
Really good people. It didn't matter who you were. It's what you did and your integrity that you brought to this. I've watched that evaporate over the years, and the place where it's fallen apart the worst is the United States. Unfortunately, Europe has resisted, but they're caving in now and becoming more and more like the American.
Before you go on with this, I want to just substantiate what Dr. Resnick is saying. He's saying that the literature that we have, the medical literature, the scientific literature, is no longer believable. And it's not just him saying it. Marcia Angel, who was a physician and chief editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Catherine DeAngelis of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Ushma Anil of another major medical journal, have all quit their jobs and said they are disappointed, disillusioned, and can't believe the low quality material that's coming across their desk that's published in their journals. And it's because of other factors. There are people who have an axe to grind, who have a mission to accomplish, who have an ulterior motive to be able to get their point across. So if a pharmaceutical company, for example, is doing a study, they're going to make it look the best they can. They're not going to invest $500 million, okay, in a study and come out and say, don't buy our drug, it sucks. So we're seeing a lot of it. So what you're saying is no more than a reflection of what they are saying. And you've personally experienced that.
Yeah, and more people are. It is such an obvious problem now that many of the mainstream people are speaking out.
Even the physicians are beginning to question it. And look at the direct-to-consumer ads and all the problems that come with that.
Right.
Big deal. But I want to take this back to this whole subject of AIDS now. We talked a little about HIV, the test, and some of the reasons why things are like they are. Tell us what AIDS is. I mean,
it stands for, the letters AIDS stand for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome.
Okay.
This acquired immune deficiency syndrome has been known long before what we call AIDS with the capital AIDS. It was principally in people who were malnourished or premature babies, for example. There were some good examples of this after World War II when the Allies went in and looked in Germany and they saw the consequences of malnutrition.
Sure.
And AIDS popped up among these children especially, and even some adults, just malnutrition. In fact, malnutrition is the world's leading cause of acquired immune deficiency.
Well, that shouldn't be a surprise. I mean,
It's no surprise.
If you don't have enough of the nutrients you need to take in, your immune system's going to go south. It can't do the job it's supposed to. So you've got an acquired immune deficiency syndrome.
That's
and
right.
the problem is the word AIDS is more charged.
Right.
People don't think what AIDS stands for.
Right.
They just think it's this horrible disease that happens because of HIV and in gay men and drug users.
And sexually transmitted.
Right.
In the industrialized world, the principal causes of acquired immune deficiency is drug treatment, chemotherapy for cancer, for example, and also drug therapy like cyclosporin A for organ transplant patients.
Okay.
The cyclosporin A is
So we're trying to interfere with immune competence.
with the organ transplant drugs.
Yes.
You intentionally depress the immune system so that the patient doesn't lose the liver or the kidney. Or whatever.
Exactly.
But you have to titrate it, or they'll get sick with AIDS
Or you
diseases.
might kill them.
You kill them. You can kill them with it. So those were the principal sources of AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome around the world.
Okay.
Recreational drugs. Peter Duisberg and I have documented over the past 100 years that chronic use of heroin and cocaine and amphetamines and the poppers, the nitrite inhalants that the gay men use almost exclusively, can cause AIDS-defining diseases. And that explains principally why the gay men, for example, were so disproportionately among the gay statistics.
So all you're saying is that these people with these kinds of lifestyles have immune deficiency problems.
That's right.
And it's acquired.
Right.
Okay, so it's AIDS.
Right. And the CDC understood this as early as 1982. They actually had it figured out. It wasn't rocket science. All this stuff is known.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that press conference, Robert Gallo was the one, who said that his retrovirus, and then he was the one that said it probably came from Africa and it's probably sexually transmitted. He's a retrovirologist. He should know better that
that's by decree again.
That by decree that retroviruses are not sexually transmitted. They're not. And even if they were, they're totally harmless.
So he had a lot to gain from this.
He did. He
became
a millionaire.
Yeah,
on
at least
HIV
a millionaire.
At least. Yeah.
So the HIV test, and then he takes a stand against anybody who has an argument against that by decree again.
But he was quietly pushed out of the NIH in the early 90s because of some very controversial work. In fact, he was convicted of scientific misconduct for basically stealing the retrovirus that we call HIV from Luc Montagnier. Right. And then I believe it was the Reagan administration that came in and said, no, we can't have our big discoverer of the cause of AIDS being convicted. So they changed the rules, and then throughout the conviction, but quietly they forced him out. So you hardly ever hear anything from Robert Gallo anymore.
That's right. Now we talk about treating acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, with drugs that are very toxic.
Right. The chemotherapy for cancer, basically.
It's true. So it's doing more to suppress the immune system.
It does. And they're extremely toxic drugs. There's not an HIV drug on the market that does not come with a black box warning label. That's the most serious warning that the FDA puts in a label before they pull the drug off the market.
Could it be that somehow, for reasons we don't understand, that the drugs that are used, like AZT and others, to treat people with AIDS, have a beneficial effect on them, on their disease in some way? Is that possible?
It's always possible for that to happen. Is it probable? I mean,
can we explain it? Would be a better way to say.
Right. Can we explain it? You probably can, but what is really clear in the literature is that these drugs in mass on the large numbers of people, 95% of the people for sure do worse on these drugs than people who don't take them.
How do you know that?
It's in the mainstream literature itself.
So you can quote the articles that say that. Why don't the doctors look at that? Or is that your question?
MDs, basically physicians, practitioners, do not read the scientific literature.
So they're basically following CDC recommendations.
That's true. but they also, you know how they learn about drugs, the pharmaceuticals? They learn about the drugs from
the drug company,
the drug salesman.
That's right.
That sends it to
That's
them.
true.
You know, they don't read the primary literature on this stuff.
Well, don't include me and they.
No, absolutely not. That's why we're here.
That's right.
It's because you're not a they.
All right. So these drugs then that are using to treat immune deficiency are actually causing it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they weren't actually designed to treat immune deficiency. They were designed to kill HIV.
Okay, that's what I meant by that.
Right.
Okay.
Assuming that HIV is destroying the immune system. However, as you mentioned, AZT, DDI, 3TC, D4T, and all these other nucleoside analogs were developed in the 1960s as chemotherapy for cancer, the chemotherapy for cancer. No physician would prescribe cancer chemotherapy for the lifetime of the patient. They would be taken up on charges for malpractice because the chemo will kill the patient if they stay on it for the life.
Right.
But yet, if you're HIV positive, if you happen to have antibodies that react on the Abbott Laboratories test or whatever you call HIV positive, the standard of care is now to give you these drugs for life. Wow. And these drugs can kill you. In fact, they do kill you. And since I think the late 1990s, the leading cause of death among HIV positive Americans is liver failure.
Right. Hear that, folks?
Caused by the drug. Caused by these drugs.
Caused by
and
the
now,
drug.
since
Leading
again,
cause of death,
about the
liver failure,
mid-1990s, there's a new problem. The AIDS.
So you're dying from the drug. That's that's the causal effect. The causal.
HIV positive Americans is liver failure.
Right.
Caused by these drugs. And now, since again, about the mid 1990s, there's a new problem. The AIDS establishment is sweeping this under the rug, and they're giving it a new name. They're calling it IRS, for Immune Reconstitution Syndrome.
That's as bad as IRS, Internal Revenue Service.
Yeah, that's easy to remember. And these drugs are causing exactly the same AIDS-defining diseases that the CDC came up with in their clinical definition of AIDS. What makes them called IRS, or Immune Reconstitution Syndrome, and not AIDS, is because these diseases now only pop up after people start taking the antiretroviral drugs, on weeks to months.
Wow.
They're exactly the same diseases as AIDS. So they're, instead of calling them drug-induced AIDS, they're called immune reconstitution syndrome.
Oh, that's sweet. That's just a bonus.
And it's a huge literature on this now. And whole conferences are devoted to this problem.
Now, this is interesting because maybe most of the doctors don't read the medical literature and do it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And they do kind of what everybody else in the profession recommends because those are the standards of practice in the community. But the pharmaceutical companies know this.
Yes, they do.
Because they make the information up.
So does the NIH.
CDC must know it.
They do.
Okay. And yet they're perpetuating this myth.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, okay. You know why it has to continue?
I think I do, but you say it.
But I'll say all a person has to do is just imagine that what we are talking about here is true. Yeah. That AIDS is not contagious. It's not sexually transmitted. It's not caused by HIV. The anti-HIV drugs are killing people and causing AIDS-defining diseases.
Wow.
And on top of that, there's no such thing as an AIDS epidemic in Africa, and we can talk about that.
That's another subject.
That's another subject entirely. If all of that is true, we spent $250 billion on this bogus blunder, this biggest scientific medical mistake of all time.
The germ of lies, huh?
Germ of lies.
The title of your book.
Right. Then what is the likelihood that the directors of the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Secretary of Health and Human Services, or any president of the United States is going to say, oops, folks, sorry, we made a mistake?
Yeah. Right.
What is the likelihood of that happening now?
Well, I guess it's not too good because it hasn't.
The CDC actually, when Peter Duesberg had his article back in 1987, in Cancer Research, where he critiqued the whole thing about retroviruses in general, HIV in particular, and how they could not cause any disease. The CDC, Peter was able to lay his hands on an internal memo that was going around that said if this got out and the public knew about it, nobody would ever believe us again. Right. That's it. That's basically it. It's not even about money anymore, really. It's about face saving. It's about the whole infrastructure or edifice of the healthcare system in the United States, possibly the whole institutional form of government would be seriously undermined by the fact that this huge $250 billion mistake was allowed to happen and it's continuing to happen, and the people in the government know it. They absolutely
There's
know
also got to be pressure too, because from the point of view of the pharmaceutical industry, we know the hold that they have on the FDA, on the Congress, because they've got a lot of money and they have more lobbyists than anybody, any companies in the world. And so they can buy their way out of a lot of this, I think.
They will come out of it clean. You know why? They're just going to the next disease, the next drug. It's the federal government is really keeping this alive. It's not the drug company, because they have their institutions that they have to consider.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and I want two subjects I still want to cover. One is the HIV kids.
Yeah.
Okay. These are kids that are HIV positive.
Right.
They're healthy.
Yeah.
If the parent won't follow the advice of the doctor and give them the AZT drug, Child Protective Services comes in and says, we're going to take the kid away from you.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
It's horrible. I've been involved in a number of these cases on the side of the parents trying to keep their kids from being taken away and being poisoned on these drugs. And I've known a number of cases over since the 90s that I've been personally involved in on a legal basis. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. These children and parents have absolutely no civil rights when it comes to health care. And that is an abomination. And I hope that these court cases, we need to put these things on trial. We need to take a lawsuit and make lawsuits against GlaxoSmithKline, and these other places that are killing people with these drugs. To public, not so much that I want to hurt them, which I don't care about that, though, one way or the other, but it's got to be publicized somehow. And the best place to do it is in the courtroom.
And that's where the data you can bring from the studies that have been done that are in the scientific literature that show all the things that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Because they're a matter of public record.
Absolutely. It's easy to come by if you really want it.
Okay, so now if somebody is HIV positive and you want to do, if you're going to do anything for somebody that's like that, you would probably propose doing nothing. But if somebody comes to you and they have even acquired immune deficiency syndrome, they have AIDS, how would you propose treating them? You use lifestyle things? You support them? I mean,
I tell you what,
we've only got about a minute or two left.
Sorry.
So I don't know how you're going to do that.
I'm not a physician. But I know one thing.
You know a lot about this.
I know a lot about this. I would treat symptoms. You know, I mean, if it's malnutrition, feed people. That's what we did in South Africa. It works like magic. It's amazing. They get better really right before your eyes almost. You don't treat them with toxic drugs. You don't. I would tell people. I'll even make it even more blunt. We need to outlaw the HIV test. We need to outlaw these tests. They're horrible. They kill people. The tests kill people because then they go on and they take the drugs and the drugs kill the people. Nobody, I would say nobody should take an HIV test. They should refuse every opportunity or any pressure to take an HIV test on them.
Can anybody force you to take an HIV test?
You can if you're in jail, for example. And they've tried to make, in some states, they force it's on a state-by-state basis. And anybody who's ever had an HIV test, totally forget about it. Erase it out of your mind if possible. Now, if you can't, then the HIV test is so unstable that the result depends on what day you take it on, where you go, and who looks at it. It's totally arbitrary.
So it might be negative one day and positive another.
Exactly. So if you're positive and you really, really want a negative, just keep taking test after test until you get the negative, and then use that result.
Okay. So maybe that's the thing to do for parents who have HIV positive kids who are doing well. And what you're saying, basically, if I understand it right, is look at the disease. Don't look at the label that's put on it.
Exactly.
And then do what you can to support that illness, doing the safest things you can that are possible.
Safe.
At lifestyle first.
Yes.
Get the healthy diet. Do exercise. Do the kinds of things that you can do to keep people to get enough rest. Reduce the stress in their life. Keep their weight down. Make sure they have a meaningful purpose in their life. We do all those things that doesn't work. Then we move on to things that are a little bit more aggressive, but certainly not thinking about using anti-cancer drugs for a disease that's been fabricated and probably doesn't even exist. That's the position you would take.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better.
It's such a privilege to have you on this show, David. Thank you so much for
I've enjoyed it
today. There are not too many people who have the courage that you do to have stuck out for so many years in an area where the public is not really receptive to hearing what you're saying, and physicians get angry with you. I've tried to put together a couple of AIDS conferences, which you know, that include you and Peter Duesberg, and have invited physicians to be there, and I've had no luck at getting one physician to face you or Peter. That tells me something. It means that some of what you're saying has to be true, and that the doctors know that, and they don't want to be involved in a position that's going to get them in trouble with their medical board or their colleagues.
You pay a serious price to speak out on this. It's cost me, it's cost Peter. You know this well. It could cost anybody.
It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
I've enjoyed it.
because it's been surrounded from day one with so much emotion, very few people are capable of looking at AIDS logically.
There is a group of AIDS denialists that say that HIV does not exist and has never been isolated, which is as bizarre as it gets.
The probable cause of AIDS has been found.
Credit must go to our eminent doctor, Robert Gallo, who produced this discovery.
Gallo said he had all these viruses, and it was a lie.
These are HIV here.
Yeah.
Oh, so are these HIV too?
Yeah.
Everything's
Probably.
Probably.
Yeah.
The presently available data does not prove the existence of HIV.
It exists. Why do you believe that HIV does cause AIDS?
Because that's all the information that I've been given.
Because that's what the scientific community has told us.
AIDS is not a disease. AIDS is a whole lot of different things.
Some countries, make up their own definition.
The more diseases they could lump into this AIDS syndrome, the more patients they could catch.
Peter is highly intelligent, but he's killing people with his theories.
I'm about to go in for my first HIV test, and I'm a little nervous. I'm not gay, I'm not a hemophiliac, and I've never used intravenous drugs.
Now, if I tell you that the test you took was lousy and didn't mean a thing, does that make any difference for everybody to hear?
Do the answers to these questions help aid in the diagnosis?
Of course they did.
Really?
HIV testing isn't an absolutely precise science.
AIDS is one thing in Greenwich Village and a very different thing in Kampala, Uganda.
The vast majority of the world's population is not at any measurable risk of HIV infection.
I think HIV totally has turned out not to be the cause of AIDS. HIV has turned out not to be.
We can be exposed to HIV many times without being chronically infected. Our immune system could get rid of the virus within a few weeks if you have a good immune system.
Some people are very fortunate and they don't have these side effects.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about...
Okay, we're going to block out the light from the sun so that we can better get away from fossil fuels. Sounds contradictory because then your solar cells won't work. Now your solar cells are down 40% and you still have to rely on their nuclear bullshit, so-called nuclear, their power plant. They need you to rely. No self-sustaining bullshit here. You got to rely on us.
$10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise...
Not to mention they're admitting chemtrails. Derp, derp.
It's a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side,
Council of Foreign Relations. This isn't like from some YouTuber, you know. Oh my God, some crazy YouTuber complaining about bullshit chemtrails. No, this is some crazy guy at the Council of Foreign Relations doing it.
Gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations.
Weather wars.
Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives. Now, I could go on and on and on and on about the things that fascinate me, but rather than talk about them, I thought I'd stop here.
Stop here. I guess he stopped there.
Another greenhouse gas emission reduction, geoengineering initiatives. Now, I could go on and on and on and on about the things that I could go on and on and on. I could go on and 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 on about the things that fascinate me. But rather than talk about them, I thought I'd stop here.
Excuse me, on the left over here, we have individuals who are religious fundamentalists, religious fanatics, and this is the expression, RT-PCR, real-time PCR expression of the VMAT2 gene. Over here, we have individuals. So let me complete. So over here, we have individuals who are not particularly fundamentalists. Not.
By the way, that's also the area of pleasure in your brain. Just so you know, he's just not mentioning that part. So he's going to get rid of your fundamentalists, right? And then you're supposed to go, hell yeah, get rid of those fundamentalists. Not realizing it's also the pleasure area in your brain. So just make everybody not feel pleasure and not need. So without all of that, there's no real passion in what you're doing either, is there? And then there's no, you know, so then you're like a lame, just a lame duck. Barely can quack. Your job is to swim eggs back and forth for the government now. Whack, whack, whack. Aflac.
Particularly religious, and you can see there's a much reduced expression of this particular gene, the VMAT2 gene. Another evidence that supports our hypothesis for the development of this approach.
Fun fact.
What you see
here is by
Excitovax.
this virus,
Super fun
we're going to
fact.
eliminate individuals from donning on a bomb vest and going into a market and blowing up the market.
So
yeah, that's so gonna do that. It's so gonna eliminate that. It's gonna eliminate the guy from bringing a bunch of flowers home to his wife every day too, because of the, you know, the pleasure zone in his brain isn't received when she says, "Oh my goodness, thank you." He doesn't feel pleasure from any of that, so it's just a fucking lame fish. One of those minnows swimming around in the pond in front of the bigger fish now because he just doesn't care about his own existence anymore. He's lame. Hey, lame fisher.
our hypothesis is that these are fanatical people, that they have overexpression of the VMAT2 gene, and that by vaccinating them against this, we'll eliminate this behavior. So we have some very, very remarkable data in this next slide. Here we have two brain scans. These are fMRIs. These are two different individuals with different levels of expression of VMAT2. On top is an individual who's a religious fanatic, an individual, and we've repeated this numerous times, that has high levels of VMAT2. Now, this individual down here who had low levels of the VMAT2 gene, this individual would self-describe as not particularly religious. In each case, these individuals were read a religious text. This individual lit up the right middle frontal gyrus, shown here, and that's the part of the brain that's associated with theory of mind. It's a part of the brain that has to do with intents and beliefs and desires. In marked contrast, here's an individual who would not particularly self-describe as religious, and when they're read a religious text, what you see is that
in my world, of course, it don't matter. You know, you could be a gangster with a good dress. You could be a gangster with baggy pants. It don't. I feel like there's no such thing as gender.
You look hot in a dress.
Thanks. Thanks. Somebody had to dress. What the fuck?
There's the gay agenda in hip hop. That was Young Thug.
It's a great thing for history.
Back to one common ancestor.
They're all cousins and all grandsons of John Lackland.
It's the first family tree of its kind, pouring through more than 500,000 names for months. 12-year-old Bridge Ann D'Avignon discovered that all the U.S. presidents, except Martin Van Buren, are related to the former King of England, John Lackland Plantagenet, signer of the Magna Carta in 1215.
Mildred Reed is his first great-grandmother on George Washington. And on Obama, Mildred Reed is the 10th great-grandmother.
It started as an assignment to research her own lineage, tracing it back to roots in France. But Bridge Ann wanted to branch out.
Well, I think we just all go back somewhere. It's just a matter of proving it.
She started with George Washington, but unlike other professional genealogists that only looked at the male family lines, Bridge Ann was able to link the presidents together using both male and female ancestry. Before this, historians had only been able to link 22 family trees.
She kind of created a triumph of women's studies here.
Bridge Ann also figured out she's an 18th cousin of President Obama.
Toss your place anytime I want. You got new... Yeah, go check it, Brittany. I'm working part-time for a lawyer. Yeah, go check if you don't believe me. I searched your place. Place. You did what? Don't play dumb. You're not dumb. You're on probation. You got no rights. I can walk in and toss your place anytime I want. You got new clothes, new shoes, nice car. Come on. Girl, you're hooking again. That is so unfair. This lawyer, he's paying you how much? It's complicated. It's complicated. You're lying to me. I need to see a 1099 to prove it. It is very difficult to get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. You're white. You're white. You're skinny. You're thin. You're white. You're skinny. You're thin. Girl, you're white. To get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. It is very difficult to get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. It is very difficult to get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. It is very difficult to get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. You're white. To get legitimate employment. Girl, you're white. Girl, you're white. Girl, you're white. Girl, you're white. You're white. You're skinny.
Mm.
The theory of gravity, relational aspect.
In the beginning was the Big Bang. We are told that 13 to 20 billion years ago, everything that makes up the universe as we know it was spontaneously created out of nothing through an unimaginably violent explosion. But did it really happen as we are told? A growing number of astronomers doubt it and are showing why. This is their story, the story of the universe.
The observational aspects of trying to understand the universe, I think it's reasonable to start about 100 years ago. And about 100 years ago, almost everybody in astronomy, without question, assumed that the whole of the universe was what you could see in the Milky Way. Nobody felt that the universe was any bigger than the stars that you see in the sky, associated with our own local Milky Way. And that was the situation certainly around 1905, times like that. They're well-known people who propounded these ideas. 10 years later, Einstein first proposed his general theory of relativity. Now, when Einstein proposed this, it's a theory of gravity, which means that it's a theory which should represent the whole of the universe, because it's gravitational forces that are controlling the universe. Well, Einstein made this theory around 1915, and he immediately wanted to try and use this theory to explain the universe as it then was, the so-called Milky Way system. But of course, the idea of this was that it was a static system. That is, it wasn't contracting or expanding, it was a static system. And Einstein found that his equations did not allow for a static universe unless he inserted a certain constant in the mathematics, which became known as the cosmological constant. But what happened in the early 1920s was that a very clever Russian called Friedman in 1922 found solutions to Einstein's equations which allow the universe to either expand or contract. Now that was done in the Soviet Union soon after the revolution, and nobody in the West knew about this, I think. But in 1927, a Belgian priest, the Abbé Lemaitre, as he later became, also discovered these solutions. And he went to England, and his work was publicized in Cambridge and elsewhere, and the famous English astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington and others got to know about this, and they immediately began to say, how can this apply to the current universe? Well, in the same period, in 1929, Hubble made what I still believe was the most important discovery in extragalactic astronomy in the last century, or the last century.
Imagine if every puzzle on Earth was solved, every why that we have pondered but could not answer for all our trying be mastered. Imagine if we all, God's ways, could clearly understand. Will this be reality, or is it just myth? Our thinking is like the streaming colored lights, flames flickering across the dark northern night. It was dark before we started thinking, and it will be dark again if we stop. Some claim that most questions in nature have been answered. Others think that we have only just begun asking. This is their story, the story of the universe.
Plasmas are found virtually everywhere. They're found in solid state matters at very low temperatures. They're a flame of a match, a fluorescent light is a plasma. Fire in your fireplace is a plasma. The aurora obviously is a plasma. The sun and all of the stars are a plasma. Lightning is plasma. In fact, 99.999%, as Alfane used to say, of all observable matter in the universe is matter in the plasma state.
A plasma is an ionized gas. It means a gas consisting of charged particles rather than neutral particles, which is the constituents of a normal gas. The charged particles are electrons and atoms that lack electrons. So it consists of negative and positive particles that interact with each other by means of electric and magnetic fields.
The term plasma, as applied to electromagnetics, was first coined in 1923 by the Nobel laureate Irving Langmuir to describe the experiments that he was doing at the time. Basically, plasma consists of charged particles, the electrons and the ions or protons that we know in nature. It can also include charged dust. And in Irving Langmuir's experiments with the charged particles, he noted that they acted almost in a lifelike manner. They tended to develop cells. They acted very much in a way that indicated that they might somehow be related to life. And for that reason, he borrowed the term plasma from the blood plasma.
A plasma is like a society of individuals where all the individuals are interacting with each other through complex interactions like media, newspapers, television, and so on. And the normal gas is like a society where the individuals simply basically don't interact or interact at very short distances, very local communities.
The first effort to understand how plasma functions in the universe, to understand the plasma universe, was Christian Birkeland, who at the end of the 19th century wanted to understand what is the nature of the aurora.
Birkeland ble interessert I nordlyset I begynnelsen av 1890-årene, og grunnen til det var utvilsomt at han arbeidet med katodestrålerør. Et katodestrålerør, det et vakuumkammer hvor man satt på en spenning. Når lufttrykket blir lavt nok, så går det en strøm gjennom. På Birkelands tid visste man ikke at det gikk en strøm, for man kjente ikke elektronene. Men allikevel så trakk han en analogi mellom disse katodestrålerørene og det som foregikk på sola.
At this time, people were studying for the first time the nature of electrons. And you had, for example, the development of the cathode ray tube, the cathode ray tube we're familiar with. This is what powers our computers and our television screens. You have electrons accelerated, smashing into phosphorescent atoms in the screen and producing light.
Allerede før den tid så mente Birkeland at dette måtte være noe som var analogt med det som skjedde mellom sol og jord. At det gikk katodestråler ut fra solflekkene og traff da jorda og skapte nordlyset. Denne sammenhengen mellom sol og jord, den hadde ligget der en stund, fordi man visste at når det skjedde store eksplosjoner på sola, for eksempel den i 1859, som var aldeles voldsom, så fikk man en stor magnetisk storm etterpå. Og utifra det så trådte Birkeland den slutning at sol og jord på den måten hang sammen, og at det var katodestrålene som laget dette. At det også da måtte være en elektrisk spenning mellom sol og jord som sendte disse strålene.
Birkeland reasoned that this might be exactly what's happening in the aurora. He basically felt that electrons coming from the sun would be channeled by the Earth's magnetic field into the atmosphere, where they would hit the atoms in the atmosphere, creating the fluorescent glow of the aurora.
Der kommer det som den store idé han får, at strømmene kommer utenfra, fra sola, går ned langs magnetfeltet, kortsluttes i den øvre del av atmosfæren og går ut igjen langs magnetfeltet. Dette var en helt ny måte å tenke på, og det forbandt jorda med universet.
He wasn't content with just looking at this theoretically. He wanted to look at it experimentally as well. So he built a scale model of the Earth as a magnet, which he called a terrella, which was a metal sphere with a magnet inside. And he put it in a vacuum chamber, and he basically modeled the system of the aurora in the Earth's magnetic field.
Typisk for Birkeland var hans metodiske framgangsmåte i vitenskapen. Han angrep problemet med sol-jord-forholdene av mange forskjellige metoder. Han angrep den teoretisk. Han var en god matematiker selv, men han fikk inspirert Carl Sturmer, en av hans yngre kollegaer, til å begynne å beregne hvordan disse partiklene beveget seg fra sol til jord. Han gjorde eksperimenter i laboratoriet for å se disse strålene, bygget disse terrella-kammerne med en magnetisk jord inne i vakuumkammeret, og hvor han da kunne se hvordan partiklene beveget seg fra sola gjennom jordens magnetfelt og landet på jordoverflaten av helst i polområdene. Han gjorde statistikk på dette, forholdet mellom sol og jord, og ikke minst, han gikk ut i felten for å observere tingene.
Birkeland's way of thinking was in direct opposition to what I would call over-specialization in science. He was doing a lot of different things, taking patents. He was thinking about cosmology and about small practical things. He was creating industries and so on. And I think the main power in his ideas when it comes to inspiration is in particular this aspect.
Han utvilsomt en av pionerene når det gjelder å bringe elektromagnetiske krefter og plasma inn i kosmologien. Og mange i dag har anerkjent ham som den pioner han var på det feltet. Og hans ideer om hvordan strømsystemene i jordas magnetfelt, i jordas magnetosfære det tilhører de klassiske ting i den moderne magnetosfærefysikk.
After his death, this whole approach of seeing the universe, as Berkeley put it, as filled with all sorts of charged electrical particles, basically fell away. He didn't have descendants, intellectual descendants who would pursue this avenue of approach.
Etter Birkelands tid så oppstod det en annen idé om at disse strømmene var skapt var rent horisontale, gikk rundt i horisontale baner i atmosfæren. Det var først og fremst Sidney Chapman fra England som var talsmann for dette. Han tilhørte de som var rene teoretikere, hadde ikke gjort noen observasjoner selv.
Chapman's approach, which is similar to that of many of the Big Bang theorists today, was to take a purely mathematical approach and say, what is the simplest way to express phenomena mathematically? And basically, let's try and fit the phenomena into that simplest mathematical expression. Well, he found that it was very difficult to precisely define the sort of mathematical three-dimensional currents that Berkeley had hypothesized. Remember, this is long before the development of computers. So he found that the easiest mathematical representation was if the currents were all confined to a sphere that extended little beyond the Earth's atmosphere. And therefore, he started to model things on this model, which completely contradicted the idea that these currents flowed from the sun and were trapped in the three-dimensional structure of the Earth's magnetic field.
Etter sin død i Tokyo i 1917 ble Birkeland stort sett glemt, også i den vitenskapelige verden. Men han må utvilsomt ha inspirert noen. Han var en inspirerende person. Han skapte aktivitet omkring seg, han sprudlet av nye ideer, og han inspirerte sine medarbeidere. Han inspirerte utvilsomt også noen i sin ettertid, og en av dem var Hannes Alfvén i Sverige, som grep fatt i Birkelands ideer om vekselvirkning mellom jordas magnetfelt og universet, og utvikle sin magnet- og hydrodynamikk, og kom i sterk opposisjon til Chapman på grunn av det.
Hannes Alfvén simply felt very much in spirit with Birkeland in this respect. Hannes Alfvén was an engineer from the start, and he liked to think about everything as an engineer and not in very abstract terms.
And he realized that it would be impossible for electrons alone to flow from the sun to the Earth. It had to be plasma flowing, because if the sun gave out a flow of electrons, eventually it would become positively charged, and that would prevent the flow from continuing. So his theory was that there were ejections of plasma from the sun. When these blobs of plasma hit the Earth's magnetic field, they would distort it. And if the distortion was enough, you would have things called magnetic storms.
It took many years before Alfvén's work in this area was recognized. And the main reason is that his work was so simple and so obvious that even the brightest people did not really realize the impact what he was doing.
He also developed at this time a more elaborated theory of how the electric currents concentrate themselves. Because of course, when you look at the aurora, it isn't just a continuous glow. It's this fine sheet of filaments. And these filaments, Alfvén knew, occurred because of what's called the pinch effect, which is if you have currents flowing through a plasma, any plasma, the currents produce magnetic fields. The magnetic fields interact with the currents in such a way the currents are attracted to each other. So if you start out with an even distribution of current, the filament will become tiny concentrated filaments of current pulled together by their own magnetic field.
The essence of magnetohydrodynamics is to boil down the very complicated motions of plasma particles in magnetic fields into a simple model that visualizes the plasma as a fluid that is electrically conducting. So it simply is a fluid where currents are allowed to flow. And the currents are interacting with the electric and magnetic fields and dragging the fluid with it. Another way to see it is that the fluid is dragging the magnetic fields with it. And this simple picture to visualize things had an enormous impact on how we could understand phenomena in space.
So he developed this pretty elaborated theory, which was compared with both laboratory experiments and observations of how the aurora works. But Chapman was still the dominant theorist, and Chapman completely rejected his theories, and in fact wouldn't even discuss it with him.
Det viser seg at det ikke er mulig å skjelne mellom de to ideene på rent observasjonsmessig grunnlag på jorda. Vi måtte ut i verdensrommet for å avgjøre hva som var riktig. Og det var det som skjedde utover på 1960-tallet, hvor man oppdaget at det faktisk gikk elektriske strømmer langs magnetfeltet, og man kalte dem Birkeland-strømmer.
Thomas Alfvén is generally credited as being the father of modern plasma physics. And he was, of course, awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970 for his extremely varied work in plasma physics. Now, by the time that satellites and space probes had begun to demonstrate that Alfvén and Falthammer's and his colleagues' ideas about currents flowing through the solar system were correct, that such currents really did exist, and people began to accept that these currents, much stronger currents during the early days of the solar system, actually had a role in the formation of the solar system, in compressing gas and dust down to form both the sun and the planets. By that time, Alfvén had started to move on to larger scales.
Alfvén was very eager on formulating very bold theories for cosmology, and basically rejected the Big Bang model, and in this way came very much in opposition to the mainstream of cosmology.
Because he reasoned that if these currents flowing through the solar system could have formed the stars and the planets, then could not have much larger scale currents also be the way the galaxies themselves form. Some people have said that science is a method for asking questions of nature. And if that's true, then we can say the Big Bang supporters are people who won't take no for an answer.
Over the last 2 or 3 decades, the Big Bang theory has become increasingly more and more speculative. One expects from a scientific theory definite predictions which can be tested by observations. If the observations disprove the prediction, the theory is supposed to be disproved, and it should be modified or abandoned.
In science, we work from observation, from empirical observation that starts in the here and now and works outwards and backwards. The Big Bang starts from mathematical formulas, deductions that start from the beginning of the universe and to try and predict it forward. This is the same mathematical approach, mathematical deductive approach that led 2,000 years ago to the development of the Ptolemaic universe. The universe, of course, which was Earth-centered, with planets going around the Earth, with the stars in a crystalline sphere. What these theories have in common is that they try and derive what should be the universe based on what perfect principles we can develop, what God should have made the universe to look like. And then they try to fit the universe into that perfect framework.
However, what has happened over the years is that whenever observations have come up which don't agree with the predictions of the Big Bang theory, the theory adds an extra assumption which is not at all tested, which is not at all resting on conventional physics, and simply assumes that that must be true.
The problem with that is that develops myth, not science. It develops a religious faith in which nothing in the real world, in the observable world, can contradict the faith in this structure, in the Big Bang. This undermines the entire scientific enterprise. The reason science has been valuable to human beings is because it allows us to predict nature in such a way as we can use nature in a predictable fashion in technology. To abandon this approach, which has served us so well, and to go to the idea that we can deduce, we can read the mind of God, as Stephen Hawking says, and deduce from perfect mathematical principles what the universe must be, is to abandon the scientific
There are those who would say that the story which follows could happen only in a dream. Regardless of where it could happen, this is the way it did happen, in this rather strange and out-of-this-world office. Whitey is entrusted with the records of good salesmen. Red, the other kind. Now, it seems that Red and Whitey never see eye to eye on matters. Naturally, this leads to many arguments.
I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. There is only one door to heaven. People would have us believe there are many doors to heaven. No one can enter with a heart of unbelief. Only a heart that believes will have entrance there. And I keep a pretty close watch on these guys.
And so
this idea of the Big Bang, which did originate at the beginning of the 20th century, the reason why it is so widespread nowadays is that it has a deep connection with the biblical creation. Instead of saying that the universe was created by God like 4,000 or 6,000 years ago, they now say it was created 10 billion years or 20 billion years. So for most people and also for many scientists, they see a connection between this creation which comes from the Bible and this scientific point of view.
In 1952, in August 1952, we had a meeting of the International Astronomical Union in Rome. And we were received by the Pope. The Pope was then Pius XII. And Pius XII made an address to the astronomers. And this address was very clear. He said, oh, the Big Bang is the Fiat Lux, and how beautiful is the astronomy, how it proves that the greatness, etc., etc., etc. And I've been always sort of an heretic in all that sort of things. I don't believe in any God. And having the Fiat Lux and the Big Bang associated each with the other made me suspicious from the very beginning.
Nowadays, the majority of the physicists and astronomers, they believe and they work with the point of view of the Big Bang, according to which the whole universe did originate out of nothing, like 10 or 20 billion years ago, in a Fiat Lux, in a moment of creation. There was nothing before, and then the whole universe did appear and then begin to expand and to grow, and our galaxy, our life came out of this great explosion in the past. But I myself I had always problems with this point of view, because they are somewhat against the principles of physics, the most basic principles of physics, which are related with the conservation of matter and conservation of energy.
Yeah, I forgot completely about the Big Bang because it just didn't interest me to look in those distant things of which the physics was rather vague and difficult to observe. But let's face it, in all the story of astronomy, for years and years and centuries, the progress came from new observations. And from confrontation of those new observations with past theories, contradictions, sometimes no contradictions, sometimes just a confirmation, but most often the contradictions led to new progress, to change in the theories.
In standard Big Bang cosmology, you have what I call a series of epicycles. The Greeks used to have epicycles, which are known as circles whose centers move on other circles, whose centers move on other circles, in order that they could correctly describe the position of a planet at any given time. They found that in some cases they had to introduce many circles before they could get anywhere near the reality. These epicycles are the assumptions that have been put in ad hoc into the theory from time to time.
The way that the Big Bang handled the cosmic microwave background is a very good example of how this process works. When the cosmic microwave background was discovered in 1964, this very smooth, even radio radiation coming from all directions at once, the smoothness of the microwave background was considered a proof of the existence of the Big Bang. Only a universal explosion, they argued, could create this smooth, even background.
Now, this is not necessarily so. Actually, the three-degree radiation, to me, has not a cosmological value. It is observed in any cosmology. In any cosmology, you can predict the three-degree radiation. So it's a proof of no cosmology at all if it can be predicted by all of them.
There's no explanation at all of the microwave background in the Big Bang theory. All you can say for the theory is that it permits you to put it in if you want to put it in. So you look and it's there, so you put it in. That's that. It isn't an explanation.
First of all, the temperature of the microwave background, basically the amount of energy, was not what the Big Bang supporters had predicted. They had predicted a much higher temperature.
So it was 50 degrees Kelvin that was being compared against the 2 to 5 degrees Kelvin from the steady state universe. Now, this may not sound like much, but in energy density, where we measure the absolute differences, the differences is 4 orders of magnitude, 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 difference. So there is an enormous difference between 50 degrees Kelvin, rather poor indicator of what is happening in the universe, and 3 degrees Kelvin.
When you read the textbooks, they don't tell the whole story. They don't present these figures, 5, greater than 5, 7, 50, and then that they did find 3. So that's very strange how the textbooks, they hide a part of history.
And the temperature of the Big Bang proponents was rapidly readjusted from 50 degrees to 3 degrees.
But their theory could be adjusted so that the temperature becomes a free variable. It's just taken as what was observed.
We have an observable universe, which is made of stars, galaxies that are not very distant. And that's all, because the 3D radiation, I would even think that it might be local. Still not. And going beyond that is, I think, a wild extrapolation, whatever it is. And physics that we could imagine to be existing there is based on nothing, because we have no test for it.
Although Big Bang advocates claim the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation as conclusive proof of their theory, history actually shows that there is a long line of well-hidden predictions previous to those made by Big Bang theorists. Not only were these predictions prior to those of Gamow and associates, but more importantly, they were made without any need for an expanding universe and with far greater precision. This shows us that observations such as the background temperature of space have no preference for one or another theory, and therefore may not be used as definitive proof of any particular model. The fact that a theory is able to describe an observation does not mean that the observation proves the theory.
This is Bob Wilson at Bell Laboratories. The noise you're listening to is noise from a radio astronomy receiver on the 20-foot horn reflector antenna. This is the original instrument with which Arno Penzias and I discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965. This radiation comes from all directions and has a thermal spectrum. It sounds, therefore, very much like the noise you would hear on an FM set or a TV set which is tuned to an unused channel. Unfortunately, only about 10% of the noise you hear is coming from the cosmic microwave background radiation. The instrument is contributing about 22 degrees of noise. The Earth's atmosphere is contributing another 4 degrees. Our Milky Way galaxy is contributing 1, and finally the cosmic microwave background radiation, another 3 degrees.
When you say that the microwave background is a perfect black body radiation, that means it is completely thermalized. The theory of black body radiation tells you that that is the ultimate state of radiation, when all information of sources from where radiation came has disappeared. Because thermalization means that it's completely smoothed out, wiped out its sources.
One of the main things that people point to as confirmation the Big Bang is a valid theory is its predictions of abundance of the light elements. This confirms that the theory is a good theory. But in fact, it doesn't. In fact, observations clearly contradict this prediction of the Big Bang. Big Bang predicts the abundance of 3 elements: helium, lithium, and the isotope deuterium, which is the heavy isotope of ordinary hydrogen.
Now, one of the conclusions from this particular hypothesis that you can make deuterium in the Big Bang was that the density of matter in the universe should not exceed a certain value. Now, over the years, in the 1960s, this seemed to be holding out. 1970s, it seemed to be holding out. But by 1980s, it had become clear that the universe has considerable amount of dark matter, which is not included in these calculations. Now, if you include all this dark matter, you exceed the limit that deuterium abundance has put. That means if you assume that all the dark matter is present, then you could not have made deuterium in the amount that is observed in the universe. So this was a way of saying that the Big Bang prediction was wrong.
To determine the density of the universe and see whether this is consistent. If the theory is right, the density of the universe determined from deuterium abundance, the one determined from lithium abundance, and the one determined from helium should all be the same number. There can only be one density of the universe. While actually that's not true. Again, these are gross contradictions. And yet again, it doesn't cause the abandonment of the theory. Big Bang theorists simply say, well, there must be something that we don't understand about the evolution of lithium, about the evolution of deuterium. And even though these predictions have steadily diverged over the course of time.
But what did the Big Bang proponents do? They wanted a way out, so they said that this extra matter, which is proving to be awkward to fit into the framework, has to be a strange kind of matter, which is often called non-baryonic matter. Non-baryonic matter is basically matter which is not made of protons, neutrons, and the kind of elements that we are made of here on the Earth, or which we see in the stars or in the interstellar medium.
Dark matter. What was dark matter? Dark matter was some matter that we don't understand. We don't know what it's about. We haven't observed it. But it isn't ordinary matter, so it doesn't enter into our equations about the light elements, and we can't see it as stars. But dark matter is 90 or 99% of the mass of the universe. This is what we call in science a fudge factor. When your equations don't work out, just write in this little plus something. Well, in this case, this was a humongous fudge factor because it was 90 or 99% of the universe.
And you have to not only postulate that this matter has to exist, but it has to exist in quantities much greater than the amount you see of ordinary matter.
And I should emphasize that people have looked for dark matter. People have looked for dark matter since it was proposed 20 years ago. Axions, WIMPs, little particles that are supposed to be floating around in space that we should, in theory, be able to observe as they pass through the Earth. Dozens of experiments have looked for these particles. Not one has been found. Again, this should be a contradiction. The way science works, you make a prediction, observation contradicts it, the theory should be rejected. But that hasn't happened. And the epicycles don't end. There's a problem with dark matter, even theoretically. Even though we can't observe it, there's still a problem with it, which is dark matter slows down the expansion of the universe. So the length of time that the universe has existed, the length of time since the Big Bang, should be shorter than what's indicated just by linear expansion. The problem is it's too short. Prediction of the cold dark matter theory is that the universe should be about 8 billion years old. Well, that's a big problem. We can determine the age of stars in our own galaxy, in the oldest globular clusters, both based on very well confirmed theories of the nuclear evolution of stars and spectroscopic observation. And the stars in our galaxy are 13 or 14 billion years old. So it's very embarrassing to have 14 billion-year-old stars in an 8 billion-year-old universe.
In addition, they went into dark energy. Now, why did dark energy come in? Because if you take the present value of the cosmological constant and the cosmological constant which came out of inflation, you find that they are not the same. Not only they are the same, but you have to find that the difference lies in something like 108 orders of magnitude. Now, can you imagine a physical theory getting the answers wrong by a factor 10 to the power 108? Yet, the Big Bang cosmologists very coolly accept this and simply put in another epicycle by saying that there is a dark energy which has changed over the time by this factor. So we have to accept that.
Dark energy is some force, again, unknown on Earth, unpredicted by any theory that we have validation of here on Earth, that causes an acceleration of the expansion of the universe. So as the universe is accelerating, and it's older than it appears on the basis of dark matter theory, and it's 15 billion years old. So we solve the problem of the age of the universe by hypothesizing yet a third completely ad hoc epicycle of dark energy. So now we have a universe which is 70% dark energy, 28% dark matter, and only 2% matter that we can observe through our telescopes and here on Earth. Epicycle is being piled onto epicycle. And in the process, what we call the predictive power of the theory is fading away to nothing. One of the most destructive features of the methodology of the Big Bang is that it conveys the idea that only experts can understand the universe. Only people versed in extremely complicated mathematics can understand the universe. That if dark matter, dark energy appear to be incomprehensible or even nonsensical, it's because you don't understand the mathematics of these complex equations. This is, of course, the argument of the emperor's new clothes. If you can't see the emperor's new clothes, then you must be either stupid or incompetent.
So this goes on, and we can find that the old Greek tradition of epicycles, which was even adopted by Copernicus and has been continuing in standard Big Bang cosmology. If we go by the history, the Keplerian orbits, which were elliptical orbits, very cleanly and neatly resolved the problem of planets. And the circles upon circles idea had ultimately to crumble down. In the same way, I suspect that the Big Bang theory will collapse under its own weight of assumptions, and a more neat theory, neat interpretation of the universe will emerge.
Does this mean that the age of the universe is not what Big Bang theorists have implied? Could the universe be eternal after all? How much are cosmologists really able to know?
We are now in a stage which can be called a plasma universe. And we are simply not privileged to know what stage the plasma universe evolved from. We do not have privilege to that information. We do not know. We will never know. And this is one major difference between the plasma universe cosmology and the Big Bang cosmology that claims to be closing in on the final answer.
The universe described by plasma cosmology is quite different. Here we are talking about a universe with no beginning and no end, an infinite universe, continuously evolving, not evolution that is continuously increasing at an ever rapid pace. It is a universe in which there is a coherence between what we can understand in the here and now on Earth and what we can understand in the rest of the universe. A universe in which there is no real limit to our ability to understand more new phenomena. And a universe in which we can apply what we learn in the universe in present-day technology.
The basic difference between plasma and all other forms of matter, that is solid liquids and gases, is that a plasma produces electromagnetic radiation and also tends to filament. So that we would expect in a simulation, which is what we see, in an experiment, which is what we see, we would expect to see throughout the cosmos a filamentary structure that is a spaghetti of currents intertwining the cosmos.
We can use plasma theory derived from experiments in the laboratory, from the basic concepts of plasma instabilities, Maxwell's equations, and from the well-known laws of gravitation, to describe and predict how the structure of the universe came into being and what that structure is. So the key question is, how could this structure come into existence? Now, in the Big Bang theory, the universe starts out extremely homogeneous, very smooth.
This was in direct contradiction to the plasma universe that insisted that the universe overall must be filamentary.
But what we have today is extremely clumpy matter. When I talk about these huge voids, the structure of voids, the matter inside the voids is less than 10%, perhaps less than a few percent as dense as the average. And the matter in the walls of these voids, where these filaments of superclusters of galaxies are located, is 10 or 20 times the average. So you have extreme clumpiness. Now, what's the problem for the Big Bang to explain this? There's a huge problem. There is not enough time since the Big Bang to form these structures. These structures are older, much older than the time hypothesized since the Big Bang.
Now, again, in interpreting the observational information, we can again go to the laboratory, which we are privileged to diagnose in any number of ways, in any number of directions, and run any number of experiments, which you can't do with the universe. But we also turn to the supercomputer simulations. Now, what a simulation does is that it allows you to model the plasma, regardless of size, put in the rather few basic initial equations, and then follow the simulation through its various nonlinear stages and the different morphologies or shapes that the plasma will take.
In Tony Peratt's simulations, as the current spirals into the center of the galaxy, turns around and moves out along the axis of the galaxy. In that central area where the current is extremely concentrated, there seemed again the potential for violent events. And Alfvén and Peratt raised the question, couldn't this be a way of explaining the extremely violent events that occur in the center of galaxies that are known as quasars, in which huge amounts of energy are released in what, by astronomical terms, is a relatively small amount of time. That is millions of years compared with the billions of years galaxies exist.
Initially, the time frame shown represent 1 billion years or so, but now we're going to carry it out for 10 billion years to see what happens to these double radio galaxies or quasars as the two filaments have evolved into. And you'll see that the tails start to elongate, and fairly soon you're going to start to see a spiral structure. And as we get closer to 10 billion years, the end of the movie, you will see that we have formed the shape, the morphology, the shape of a spiral galaxy.
Now, Alfvén developed a number of concepts that were critical to the whole understanding of the plasma universe. First of all was the basic concept of scale invariance in plasmas. That means there are certain phenomena in plasmas that don't change regardless of whether you're dealing with a laboratory scale of centimeters or a solar system scale of millions of kilometers or a galactic scale of hundreds of thousands of light years. What that meant was that time scales the same way as distance does. So not only does this mean that the phenomena of the cosmos can be studied in the laboratory, but because of time compression, phenomena of the cosmos are essentially transient phenomena. It's funny to think of a galaxy lasting billions of years as a transient phenomenon, but it's analogous to events in a laboratory that last only millions of seconds. Another way of putting it, the plasma universe is extremely dynamic.
It's not going to be hypothesis. We've moved further than hypothesis. We've definitely gone into the second lake, the analysis, and we're well towards the third lake. Now, we haven't reached the third lake, of course, and perhaps, well, you can't with the universe because you can't experiment with the universe itself. Now, of course, we, like Alfvén, his idea, indeed you can determine what's happening in the universe in an experiment, but as far as producing universes, well, we're not going to do that. So we're going to do the best we can in the laboratory.
The universe that the Big Bang envisions and the universe of plasma cosmology are very different universes, and they have very different implications, and they cohere with very different ideologies of what is happening here on Earth.
The Big Bang theory will collapse under its own weight of assumptions, and a more neat theory, neat interpretation of the universe will emerge.